He invited his ex-wife to his wedding just to watch her break. But when she stepped out with bodyguards, everything he thought he knew shattered beyond repair. There are moments in a man's life when he believes he has won, when he looks around at everything he has built, everything he has earned, everything he has taken back from the wreckage of his own past. And he tells himself quietly, almost reverently, that this is it. This is the moment all the pain was pointing toward. Marcus Dillon was standing in exactly one of those moments on the morning of Saturday, October the 14th, dressed in a charcoal grey custom suit that had been tailored 3 times to sit perfectly across his broad shoulders, a glass of aged bourbon in his hand, and a smile on his face that he had been rehearsing for 2 years. Not rehearsing the way a dishonest man rehearses a lie, rehearsing the way a wounded man rehearses his resurrection. There is a difference, and Marcus knew it. He had lived inside that difference every single day since the divorce. The venue was the Grandeur Hall in downtown Atlanta, a property that Marcus himself had partially financed through his real estate development firm, Dillon Capital Group. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, vaulted ceilings draped in ivory fabric, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city skyline like the whole of Atlanta had been arranged there just for him. 400 guests had been invited: senators, developers, athletes, pastors, community leaders, and old friends who had watched Marcus fall and then watched him rise again with a kind of quiet awe. The flowers were white orchids and deep burgundy roses. The caterers had been flown in from New York. The photographer had shot 3 magazine covers the previous year alone. Everything about this wedding was designed to say one thing, and one thing only: Marcus Dillon had arrived. But the flowers and the marble and the 400 guests were not the most important detail about this wedding. The most important detail, the one that Marcus had personally attended to himself, the one he had lost sleep over, the one he had turned over in his mind with the focused precision of a man laying out a battlefield strategy, was the guest list. Specifically, one name on that guest list. One name that had no business being there by any conventional social understanding, and yet was there because Marcus had placed it there himself, deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was doing. That name was Camille Dillon. His ex-wife, Camille Dillon, née Camille Washington, had been Marcus's wife for 11 years. They had met when they were both 24 years old, both hungry, both impossibly in love with a version of the future that only the young can love without flinching. Marcus had been a junior associate at a commercial real estate firm then, wearing suits that were slightly too big and carrying a briefcase that belonged to his father. Camille had been finishing her MBA at Emory, working weekends as a restaurant hostess to cover the gap between her scholarship and her rent. They had met at a fundraising gala for a childhood literacy nonprofit, and Marcus had spent 45 minutes pretending to be interested in the auction items, just so he could keep standing near her. She had known exactly what he was doing. She had let him keep doing it anyway. That was Camille. She always knew more than she let on. Their 11 years together had not been easy years. Marcus would tell you that himself without any bitterness now, or at least without the kind of bitterness that distorts the truth. They had been poor together first, the kind of poor that tests the architecture of love and reveals whether it was built on anything solid. They had argued about money in apartments with thin walls. They had skipped vacations and deferred dreams and eaten cereal for dinner more nights than Marcus could count while he was grinding toward the career that would eventually become Dillon Capital Group. Camille had believed in him during those years with a ferocity that still moved him when he was honest with himself. She had worked, saved, encouraged, and sacrificed in ways he had not always acknowledged with the gratitude they deserved. And then the money had come. Not all at once, but quickly enough that it changed things before either of them had time to prepare for the change. Dillon Capital Group had landed its first major contract when Marcus was 31, a mixed-use development in West Atlanta that earned him a profile in the Atlanta Business Chronicle and a sudden dizzying access to rooms he had only previously read about. Success did not corrupt Marcus Dillon in the ways that success usually corrupts men. He did not become cruel or vain or dishonest in his dealings. What he became instead was distant, consumed, unavailable in the quiet, cumulative way that is somehow more damaging than any single dramatic betrayal, because there is nothing specific to point to, nothing to have out, nothing to resolve. He was simply increasingly not there. Camille had tried to reach him across that distance for 3 years. He knew that now, in a way, he had not been willing to know it while it was happening. She had suggested counseling twice, and he had agreed both times and then cancelled both times because of work. She had planned a trip to Montego Bay for their 9th anniversary, and he had flown home a day early because of a deal that ultimately fell through anyway. She had left notes for him on the kitchen counter, actual handwritten notes on paper, because she understood that emails and texts were too easy for him to engage with superficially, and he had read those notes and filed them away in the part of his mind where he kept things that required his emotional attention, which was a part of his mind he visited with less and less frequency as Dillon Capital Group grew larger and more demanding. The divorce papers had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 3 years ago. Marcus had been in his office on the 14th floor, reviewing a site acquisition proposal when his assistant had called through to tell him that a courier had arrived with a personal delivery. He had signed for the envelope without any premonition, had opened it at his desk, had read the first page, and then sat completely still for a long time, long enough that his assistant had knocked on the glass partition twice to ask if everything was all right. He had told her yes. He had finished the site acquisition review. He had driven home that evening to an apartment that Camille had already begun the process of quietly, methodically clearing of her presence, the way a tide pulls back from the shore, gradually, completely, and with perfect indifference to the landscape it leaves behind. He had not fought the divorce. That was the thing that ate at him later, during the long reconstruction period when he was rebuilding himself from the inside out. He had not fought it because he had told himself he was being mature, dignified, respectful of her decision. But the truth he arrived at only after 18 months of therapy that his new fiancée Dominique had insisted upon, was that he had not fought the divorce because fighting it would have required him to be fully present. And being fully present was the very thing he had failed at for years. To fight for Camille would have been to prove her point, so he had let her go. And then he had spent the next 2 years becoming something extraordinary in his grief. He had closed 3 of the biggest deals of his career. He had purchased a penthouse on Peachtree Street. He had started working out every morning at 5:30 with the discipline of a man who needs physical exhaustion to keep his thoughts manageable. He had met Dominique Pierce at a charity auction 14 months after the divorce, a tall, elegant woman who worked as a cardiovascular surgeon at Grady Memorial Hospital, who laughed at his jokes with genuine amusement, who did not need anything from him financially, who seemed, in every visible way, to represent a new and better chapter. He had fallen in love with her in the measured, deliberate way of a man who has learned to be careful with himself. And the love was real. He wanted to be clear about that, even now, even knowing what would happen next. His love for Dominique was real, but so was the invitation he had sent to Camille. It had started as a thought he entertained and then dismissed, the way sane people dismiss the thoughts they know are beneath them. He had imagined Camille's face when she received the invitation, had imagined her confusion, her hurt, the quiet devastation of watching the man whose growing success had always been partially hers opening a new chapter with someone else in a ceremony so grand it would be covered in the social pages of every publication in Atlanta. He had told himself he was not that kind of man. He had put the thought away, and then it had come back stronger, carrying with it a weight of justification that surprised him with its force. She had left him. She had given up on 11 years and walked away on a Tuesday in March, while he was reviewing site acquisition proposals. She had not cried in the mediator's office. She had signed the papers with a steady hand and looked at him afterward with an expression he still could not entirely decode. Not cold, not satisfied, not sad in the way he had expected, just clear, as if she had finally arrived. Somewhere she had been navigating toward for a long time. That clarity had been the thing that undone him most. He could have made peace with her crying. He could have made peace with anger. What he could not make peace with was her composure, because her composure told him that she had been ready to leave him for longer than the papers took to arrive, and that understanding, that she had grieved the marriage while she was still in it, while he was still there believing everything was fixable, had lived inside him like a splinter he could never quite reach. So he had sent the invitation. He had addressed it personally, written her name in his own handwriting on the envelope, and included a brief handwritten note that read, simply, "I hope you'll come. I want you to see who I've become." He had told himself it was closure. He had told himself it was the final, clean act of a man who had processed his pain and was ready to move forward without residue. Dominique did not know he had sent it. That was the detail he had not allowed himself to examine too closely. If it was truly about closure, if it was truly the dignified gesture of a healed man, there would have been no reason to keep it from Dominique. The fact that he had kept it from her was the fact that told him everything. But Marcus Dillon, on the morning of October the 14th, in his charcoal grey suit with his aged bourbon and his rehearsed resurrection smile, was not yet ready to be told everything. He was standing at the window of the groom's suite looking out over Atlanta when his best man, Darnell Cooper, walked in carrying 2 more glasses of bourbon and wearing the expression of a man who has been sitting on a secret and is beginning to find the weight of it uncomfortable. Darnell was Marcus's oldest friend, a man who had known him since they were 7 years old at the same elementary school in Mechanicsville, who had been at Marcus's side through every chapter of his life with a loyalty that asked nothing and gave everything. Darnell also knew about the invitation. He was the only person who did, because Marcus had needed someone to either affirm the decision or talk him out of it, and Darnell had done neither, which in retrospect was its own kind of answer. "She's here," Darnell said, handing Marcus the glass without preamble. Marcus took the glass, took a slow breath, looked out at the skyline. "I know," he said, because the front desk had already sent word to the suite when Camille checked into the hotel the previous evening. The wedding was being held at the Grandeur Hall, but the venue included an adjoining luxury hotel where a block of rooms had been reserved for out-of-town guests. He had not expected her to stay the night before. He had assumed she would come only for the ceremony, sit somewhere visible, register the scale and the splendor of everything he had built, and leave quietly before the reception began, carrying whatever feelings she needed to carry in private. The fact that she had checked in the evening before and had been in the hotel all night, in the room down the hall from the suite he had reserved for himself, that had not been part of the plan. "She didn't come alone," Darnell said. Marcus turned from the window. "What do you mean?" Darnell's jaw moved slightly before the words came out. "She came with 2 men, checked in with them last night. Big guys. Marcus, professional. Staff downstairs thought they were her security detail." Marcus stared at him. The bourbon glass was very still in his hand. "Bodyguards," he said. It was not a question. That's what it looked like. Marcus turned back to the window. The skyline was gold and grey in the October morning, the kind of morning that Atlanta produces. In autumn, like an apology for the brutal summer. He held the glass of bourbon and he thought about Camille Washington, who had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in College Park, whose mother had worked the overnight shift at Hartsfield-Jackson for 17 years, who had married him when they were both 24 with $50 left in her checking account, arriving at his wedding with bodyguards. He thought about the note he had written, "I want you to see who I've become." And for the first time since he had dropped that envelope in the mail, a cold and formless unease moved through him like weather, slow and total and impossible to stop once it had started. He did not say anything else to Darnell. He finished the bourbon. He straightened his jacket. He told himself the feeling would pass. He told himself today was still his day. He walked to the mirror in the groom's suite and he looked at himself for a long moment. At the suit that had been tailored 3 times, at the face that had not slept entirely well, at the eyes of a man who had invited his ex-wife to his wedding and was only now, on the morning of the ceremony, beginning to fully reckon with why. Downstairs in the corridor outside room 214, Camille Dillon stood in a silk robe and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror of her hotel room with the composed, deliberate attention of a woman who has already decided what this day will be. She looked at her face, the strong jaw, the clear eyes, the set of her mouth, and she breathed in slowly and breathed out completely, the way her therapist had taught her. She had her own bourbon, untouched on the marble counter beside the sink. She had music playing softly through the room's Bluetooth speakers, something low and melodic, the kind of song that does not demand your attention but simply holds the air around it gently. She was not nervous. That was the thing Marcus would not have predicted, and that she knew for certain, and that would cost them both before the day was over. She was not nervous at all. She was ready. The morning moved away. Mornings do when something enormous is waiting. Inside them, slowly at first, with an almost cruel ordinariness, as if the universe has no interest in acknowledging the weight of what is about to unfold. The hotel staff moved through the corridors with their carts and their quiet efficiency. The florists made their final adjustments in the grandeur hall's main ballroom, threading burgundy roses into arrangements that had taken 3 days to design. The caterers unpacked crates in the kitchen. The string quartet ran through their repertoire one last time in the corner of the reception room. Everything was proceeding on schedule. Everything looked exactly as Marcus had planned it. And yet, on the 2nd floor of the adjoining hotel, in room 214, Camille Washington was doing something that nobody in that building, not Marcus, not Darnell, not the 400 guests, who were beginning to arrive in their finest clothes and their most carefully considered expressions of celebration, could have predicted or prepared for. She was getting dressed, not in the quiet, unremarkable way that a guest gets dressed for a wedding she has been reluctantly obligated to attend. She was getting dressed the way a woman gets dressed when she has decided, with full deliberation and complete peace of mind, to be unforgettable. The dress had been chosen 6 weeks ago, after Camille had received the invitation and sat with it for 3 days before making any decision at all. She had not called anyone in those 3 days. Not her sister Renata, not her best friend Priya, not her therapist Dr. Elaine Moss, whose calm and measured voice had guided Camille through the 2 hardest years of her life. She had sat with the invitation alone, the way she had learned to sit with difficult things, and she had let it say everything it was trying to say. She had read it more than once. She had turned it over. She had held the handwritten note, "I want you to see who I've become," and she had felt something that was not quite anger and not quite sadness, and not quite the devastation Marcus had intended to produce, what she had felt sitting in the living room of her condo in Buckhead with the invitation in her hands, and the city below her through the floor-to-ceiling windows was something closer to clarity. The same clarity, as a matter of fact, that she had felt the morning she signed the divorce papers, when Marcus had looked at her from across the mediator's table with an expression of stunned bewilderment, as if he had genuinely expected a different outcome after years of quiet, structural absence. She had RSVP'd yes on the 4th day. She had done it calmly, without theatre. And then she had called her assistant at Renata Washington Consulting, the firm she had built from the ground up in the 3 years since the divorce, and she had begun making arrangements. The bodyguards had been the idea of her head of security, a former Secret Service agent named Gerald Price, who had come to work for Camille after the firm had crossed a revenue threshold that made personal security not only reasonable but advisable. Gerald had not asked questions. When Camille told him she needed 2 agents for a Saturday in Atlanta, He had simply confirmed the details and made the arrangements. Camille had told him only that the event was a wedding. Gerald, who was a perceptive man, had asked no follow-up questions. The dress was a deep, burnished gold, the particular shade of gold that exists at the edge of amber, where warmth becomes something almost architectural. It had been designed by a woman named Solange Vidal, a black French-American designer based in Washington, D.C., whose work Camille had been following for 2 years. It fit her the way clothes fit women, who have spent 2 years rebuilding themselves from the cellular level, not in the showy, self-conscious way of someone performing confidence, but in the quiet, settled way of someone who has arrived inside their own body and chosen to stay there. The neckline was elegant. The silhouette was precise. There was a small train that moved behind her when she walked in a way that was not dramatic but was unavoidably present. She had paired it with heels the color of dark cognac, a single strand of South Sea pearls that had been her grandmother's, and earrings that her company's first major client had sent as a gift when the firm had closed its first 8-figure contract. She wore almost no makeup, a deliberate choice, because Camille had learned that restraint, deployed correctly, is louder than spectacle. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror that the hotel room provided, and she allowed herself one long, honest moment of self-appraisal. Then she nodded once with the quiet finality of a woman who has nothing left to prove to herself and is about to go say something true to the world without saying a single word. There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Gerald and his colleague, Agent Thomas Brewer, both in dark suits, both carrying the composed, watchful stillness of men who are paid to be the calmest people in any room. Gerald looked at her and allowed himself one brief professional appraisal. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," Camille said. She picked up her clutch from the console table by the door. She stepped out of room 214. The door closed behind her with a soft, certain click. The corridor was quiet. The carpet was thick enough to absorb the sound of her heels. Gerald walked on her left, Thomas on her right, both of them at the precise distance that communicates protection without crowding. They moved through the corridor toward the elevator with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who have somewhere to be and have already decided that the arrival will happen on their terms. Camille looked straight ahead. Her hands were still. Her breathing was even. She thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of discipline, because there was a great deal available to think about on this particular morning in this particular corridor. She did not think about the 11 years. She did not think about the apartment with the thin walls, or the cereal dinners, or the notes she had left on the kitchen counter. She did not think about Montego Bay. She did not think about the mediator's office or the way Marcus had looked at her across the table as if the steadiness of her hand was a betrayal rather than a mercy. She did not think about any of it, because she had already thought about all of it, at great length in the appropriate rooms, Dr. Moss's office, her own living room at 2 in the morning, the hiking trail near Stone Mountain where she went when thoughts required movement to be resolved. She had done the work. She was not here today because she was unfinished. She was here today because she was complete. The elevator opened. They stepped in. The doors closed. Camille watched her reflection in the polished elevator doors and felt, for just a moment, the strange doubling sensation of being both entirely herself and somehow also a character in a story that had been set in motion by someone else's ego. Marcus had written the first line of today by sending that invitation, but he had made the mistake that all authors make when they try to write other people. He had assumed she would respond to his story as a supporting character, arriving on cue to play the role he had written for her. Devastated ex-wife, humbled bystander, evidence of the life he had outgrown. He had imagined her small in this moment, and that imagining had told her more about where Marcus Dillon still was, emotionally, than anything he could have said out loud. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Camille stepped out. What happened in the next 45 seconds would be described differently by everyone who witnessed it, Because people describe what they are capable of seeing, and different people in that lobby that morning were capable of seeing different things. The hotel staff who were present would later say, with the particular frankness of people who see a great deal of human behavior in the course of their working lives, that it was one of the most striking entrances they had ever witnessed, and not because of anything theatrical, not because Camille announced herself or performed anything, but simply because of the specific combination of the dress and the bearing, and the two large, suited men flanking her, and the absolute composure with which she moved through the space. The guests who were crossing the lobby at that moment, several of whom knew Camille, several of whom knew Marcus, several of whom knew the full history of the Dillon divorce with the detailed accuracy that Atlanta's black professional community tends to maintain about its prominent members, registered the moment with the wide, private attention of people watching something historical occur. Camille did not pause in the lobby. She did not look around the room seeking recognition. She did not check her phone or adjust her dress or do any of the small, self-conscious things that people do in public spaces when they are aware of being watched. She simply walked through the lobby, through the arched connection that led from the hotel into the Grandeur Hall's foyer, with Gerald on her left and Thomas on her right, her train moving behind her with that quiet, inevitable presence, her grandmother's pearls catching the light in the foyer with a warmth that the decorators' carefully chosen fixtures could not have improved upon. The foyer was where the early arrivals were gathering, the guests who come early to a wedding because they want good seats or because they are the kind of people who feel that arriving precisely on time is a social statement. There were perhaps 60 people in the foyer when Camille walked through it. 60 people in their finest, with their champagne flutes from the pre-ceremony reception, with their conversations about Atlanta real estate and the new restaurant on Ponce and the game last Sunday, all of it suspended for a moment, not a dramatic movie pause moment, but a real human moment. The kind where the normal frequency of a room is interrupted by something that requires the room to recalibrate. Eyes moved. Conversations found natural stopping points that were not entirely natural. A woman named Sandra Briggs, who had been Marcus's client for 4 years and Camille's sorority sister at Spelman, touched the arm of the woman beside her with a small, wordless pressure that communicated everything. Camille moved through the foyer and found her seat with the assistance of the ceremony usher, a young man named Caleb, who had been briefed, as all the ushers had been, to seat guests according to the chart Marcus had provided. Marcus had placed Camille in the 5th row on the groom's side, center, visible from the altar but not so close that her presence would be immediately overwhelming. He had thought about this placement with the strategic precision he applied to everything, close enough that he could register her face during the ceremony, far enough that she would understand she was a spectator. The usher led Camille to her row. She sat down. Gerald and Thomas positioned themselves at the end of the row with the quiet efficiency of men who have done this in far more complicated environments. Camille placed her clutch on her lap, crossed her ankles, and looked toward the altar with the calm, neutral expression of a woman who has paid her admission and is prepared to watch the performance. Around her, the foyer was repopulating with a slightly different energy than it had carried before, a charge in the air, a heightened quality of attention. The specific atmospheric change that occurs when something unpredictable has entered a carefully managed space. 2 floors above, in the groom's suite, Marcus Dillon's phone buzzed. It was a text from Darnell, who was downstairs in the foyer managing arrivals. The text contained no words. It was a photograph. The photograph showed the foyer from a distance, the champagne flutes, the orchids, the guests in their finery, and in the center of the frame, unmistakable, was Camille in the gold dress with Gerald on her left and Thomas on her right, moving through the space with an ease and an authority that the photograph captured with a cruelty that Marcus had not anticipated. He looked at the photograph for a long time, He enlarged it with his fingers. He looked at the dress. He looked at the men flanking her. He looked at her face, at the composure on it, at the absence of the devastation he had been picturing for weeks, and he felt the cold, formless unease from earlier that morning return and settle in his chest with a permanence that the remaining hours of the day would only deepen. He put the phone face down on the dressing table. He looked at himself in the mirror one more time. He told himself that it was fine. He told himself she was just a guest, just a woman attending a wedding, and that her dress and her composure and her security detail meant nothing about him, reflected nothing back at him, changed nothing about this day that he had built so carefully. He told himself he was still in control. He straightened his tie. He picked up his boutonniere and handed it to Darnell, who had appeared in the doorway with an expression that Marcus chose not to examine. "How does she look?" Marcus asked, because he could not stop himself. Darnell was quiet for a moment. Then he said with the specific honesty of a man who has been a best friend for 30 years and therefore cannot afford to lie. "Like she won, Marcus." Marcus said nothing. He pinned the boutonniere to his lapel. He thought about the note he had written. "I want you to see who I've become." And he thought about the photograph on his phone, and he thought, for the first time with something approaching real clarity, that invitations are strange things. They always carry an assumption about who holds the power in the act of arriving. And he had made perhaps a very expensive assumption. Downstairs in the grand ceremony hall, the seats were filling. The string quartet had shifted to something deeper and more deliberate. The orchids and burgundy roses lined the aisle in perfect symmetry. 400 people settled into their chairs with the hushed, anticipatory energy of an audience that senses, not yet consciously, but somewhere below the surface of the occasion, that what they are about to witness is more than a wedding, that it is in fact the beginning of a reckoning that none of them, not the guests, not the groom, not even Camille herself, can yet see the full shape of. But shape it had, and it was coming. Slowly, with the particular patience of things that have been building for years, it was coming. The string quartet played on. The orchids held their stillness. The light through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the particular gold of an Atlanta October morning, full and warm and indifferent, the way, beautiful, things always are when they are, present at the beginning of disaster. And in the fifth row, center, on the groom's side, Camille Washington uncrossed and recrossed her ankles, adjusted the single strand of South Sea pearls at her throat, and waited. The ceremony began at 11 o'clock as scheduled, because Marcus Dillon was a man who believed that punctuality was a form of power, and on this day of all days he intended to hold every form of power available to him. The double doors at the rear of the grand hall opened with the kind of slow, theatrical precision that only comes from rehearsal, and the processional music swelled from the string quartet in a way that moved through the chest before it reached the ears. The guests rose, 400 people in their finest, turning toward the doors with the collective, instinctive attention of a crowd that has been waiting for the main event. And for a moment, just a moment, the room was unified in its anticipation, all of its private conversations and observations and calculations suspended in the simple, ancient beauty of a processional beginning. The wedding party came first. 6 groomsmen and 6 bridesmaids, paired and measured, moving down the aisle with the rehearsed synchronization of people who have been told exactly where to place their feet and at what pace. They were beautiful, all of them, young, well-dressed, carrying the particular radiance of people who are adjacent to a significant occasion and have absorbed some of its light. The guests smiled and murmured and took photographs on their phones, and the string quartet played with the full, generous attention of musicians who understand that their job is not simply to make sound, but to hold the emotional architecture of a room. Marcus came last among the men, escorted to the altar by his mother, Evelyn Dillon, a small, immaculately dressed woman of 62 who had raised Marcus alone after his father left when Marcus was 9, and who walked beside her son with a pride so total and so long-earned that it was almost painful to witness. Marcus walked with his chin level, and his shoulders back and his face arranged in an expression of composed, forward-looking joy that cost him considerably more effort than it appeared to. He did not look at the fifth row as he passed it. He had decided in the groom's suite that he would not look at the fifth row. He had made this decision with the same deliberate discipline he applied to business. Negotiations. Identify the thing most likely to destabilize you, and do not look at it directly until you are ready. He was not yet ready. He reached the altar and took his position beside Darnell and the officiant, Pastor Raymond Graves, a man of 68, who had been presiding over weddings and funerals and every significant passage in between for the Atlanta community for 4 decades, and who had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have stood at enough altars to understand that what happens at them is always more complicated than it appears. Pastor Graves looked at Marcus with warm, steady eyes and gave him a small nod, and Marcus nodded back. And for a moment the two men simply stood in that nod, in the uncomplicated quiet of it, before the room shifted again for the entrance of the bride. Dominique Pierce entered from the side door to the left of the altar, accompanied by her father, Dr. Harold Pierce, a retired orthopedic surgeon from Savannah who walked with the unhurried dignity of a man who has spent a lifetime being the most competent person in any room and has made his peace with it. Dominique was breathtaking. There was no other word, and Marcus, looking at her as she appeared in the doorway, felt the realness of his love for her arrive with a force that temporarily displaced everything else, the unease, the photograph on his phone, Darnell's words, the fifth row. Dominique was in ivory silk, fitted through the bodice and flowing from the waist in a way that suggested movement even in stillness. And she wore her hair natural and pinned back with a single gardenia, and she walked toward him with the unhurried confidence of a woman who has made a decision she is entirely at peace with. She was smiling. The smile was real. Marcus smiled back, and that smile was real too. In the moment that it happened, which was the particular tragedy of what was already in motion, that none of it was false, that the love was genuine, that the day was beautiful, that all of it was also simultaneously sitting on a foundation that Marcus himself had undermined with the careful, deliberate placement of a single gold envelope in a mail slot 6 weeks ago. Dominique reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in Marcus's and stepped back. Their eyes met. Marcus felt the weight of her hand in his and thought, briefly, involuntarily, with a guilt he immediately tried to suppress, that he did not deserve the steadiness of that hand. Not today, not in this particular ceremony. He pushed the thought away. Pastor Graves began to speak. The ceremony proceeded. Pastor Graves spoke about covenant and commitment and the particular courage required to choose another person, not in the easy moments but in the hard ones, to remain present when presence is difficult, to love not as an emotion but as a practice. His words were measured and warm and occasionally specific enough that several people in the audience shifted in their seats with the recognition of being spoken to directly. Marcus listened with as much of his attention as he could give, which was perhaps 70%, because the remaining 30% was distributed across the room in ways he could not entirely control. He could feel the fifth row, not literally, not with any physical sensation, but with the specific, maddening awareness that belongs to people who are trying very hard not to think about something. He could feel Camille's presence in the room the way you feel the presence of a word you are trying not to say by the shape of the space it occupies. He had not looked at her. He had kept his eyes on Dominique, on Pastor Graves, on the altar flowers, on the middle distance. But the awareness was there, persistent, a low frequency running beneath the ceremony like a current beneath still water. It was during the exchange of vows that Marcus finally looked. He did not plan to. He had instructed himself clearly not to. But there is a category of human action that exists below the reach of instruction, that belongs to the body's older, more persistent intelligence. And it was this intelligence that turned his eyes, just briefly, just for one unguarded second during the pause before he began his own vows. Toward the fifth row, Camille was looking at him. She was not looking at him with devastation. She was not looking at him with anger or longing or any of the emotions he had imagined when he had constructed this moment in his mind over the preceding weeks. She was looking at him with something that, in the fraction of a second before he pulled his eyes away, registered as something close to compassion. Not pity. Compassion is different from pity. Requires more from the person offering it. Implies a more complete understanding of the person it is directed toward. She was looking at him the way you look at someone you have fully understood and fully forgiven and are now simply watching. From a safe and completed distance, make a choice. Marcus looked away. He looked at Dominique. He said his vows. His voice was steady. The words were true. He meant every one of them in the way that a man can mean true things while simultaneously standing in the middle of a mistake he has not yet acknowledged. Pastor Graves pronounced them husband and wife. The room erupted in the warm, collective joy of 400 people who are present at a moment they will tell their children about. Marcus kissed Dominique and held her hand, and turned to face the room, and smiled the smile of a man who has everything and felt. In the center of that smile, in the precise location where uncomplicated joy should have lived, a hollow that the applause of 400 people could not fill. The recessional began. Marcus and Dominique walked back down the aisle together, followed by the wedding party, followed by the organized dismissal of Rose by the ushers, and the room dissolved into the beautiful, noisy, celebratory chaos of a reception beginning. People moved toward the doors. Conversations restarted with the heightened energy of people who have shared a significant experience. Champagne appeared. Music transitioned from the string quartet to something warmer and more rhythmic from the DJ in the reception hall. The afternoon was opening up like a room that has been waiting, and it was in this moment of organized, beautiful chaos, in the movement and the noise and the champagne and the congratulations, that Marcus made his second mistake. He had made his first mistake 6 weeks ago with the invitation. His second mistake he made now, in the corridor outside the grand hall, where the receiving line was forming and the guests were filing through in a procession of embraces and good wishes and photographs. He saw Camille moving through the crowd, toward the corridor's exit, not toward the receiving line, not toward him, simply moving with Gerald and Thomas through the space, with that same unhurried self-possession, clearly intending to pay her respects to the occasion in the most minimal way. Available and then depart, and something in Marcus, some combination of the unease and the hollow, and the fraction of a second at the altar, when she had looked at him with compassion, instead of devastation, reached out and took hold of the situation before his better judgment could intervene. He excused himself from Dominique's side. "Just for a moment," he said. "Just someone I need to speak to quickly." Dominique, who was engaged in a warm embrace with her college roommate, looked at him with a brief, trusting smile and turned back to her conversation. Marcus moved through the crowd. He reached Camille just as she was approaching the corridor's exit. "Camille," he said. She stopped. She turned. The gold dress moved with her. Gerald and Thomas stilled on either side of her with the immediate, quiet attentiveness of men whose entire profession consists of reading the spaces between people. Camille looked at Marcus with exactly the expression she had worn from the fifth row. Complete, contained, arrived. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, which was the first thing that destabilized him, because he had somehow expected her voice to have changed, to have become smaller or larger or in some way different, to have registered the distance between then and now. It had not. It was the same voice, low, clear, warm at its edges without being soft. "I'm glad you came," he said, and even as he said it, he was aware that this was not what he had meant to say, that the script he had written for this moment, the brief, gracious, slightly superior acknowledgement of a man secure in his triumph, had not survived contact with the reality of her standing in front of him in the gold, dressed with the pearls and the bodyguards and the composure. "I'm glad I came too," she said, and the simplicity of it stopped him completely. He searched her face for the thing he had expected, the hurt, the loss, the evidence of his victory, and found nothing there that fit those categories. He found something that confused him more than hurt would have, because hurt he had prepared for. What he found instead was a kind of settled warmth, the warmth of a person who has done the full work of loving something and grieving it and releasing it and has arrived somewhere real on the other side. It was the warmth of completion, and it made him feel standing in the corridor of the most expensive wedding Atlanta had seen that year, strangely and thoroughly diminished. "You look," he started. "You should get back to your wife," Camille said. Not unkindly, not with the pointed edge of a woman making a point, but with the simple, direct clarity of a woman offering someone a way out of a conversation that is not serving either of them. "She's beautiful, Marcus. Congratulations. I mean that." She held his gaze for one more moment, long enough for him to understand that she did mean it, that the congratulations were real, that she was not here performing graciousness, but actually possessing it. And then she turned. Gerald and Thomas moved with her. She walked toward the exit with the same unhurried, self-possessed ease with which she had entered, her train moving behind her, the pearls catching the light one more time. And Marcus stood in the corridor and watched her go, and felt the full weight of the hollow he was carrying land on him with a completeness that the ceremony and the vows and the 400 applauding guests had not produced. He stood there for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then Darnell appeared at his elbow, because Darnell always appeared when Marcus most needed someone to appear, or most needed someone not to, depending on the day. "Dominique is asking for you," Darnell said. "I know," Marcus said. "What did she say?" Marcus looked at the exit through which Camille had disappeared. He thought about, "I want you to see who I've become." He thought about what he had expected that sentence to do to her, and about what it had actually produced, which was a woman in a gold dress with bodyguards who had looked at him from the 5th row with compassion and told him to get back to his wife, and meant it genuinely. She said, "Congratulations," Marcus said. Darnell was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's it?" "That's it." Another silence. Darnell exhaled slowly through his nose. "Marcus," he said, with the specific, careful weight of a man about to say something that needs to be received carefully. "What exactly were you expecting?" Marcus did not answer. He turned and walked back toward the reception hall, back toward Dominique, back toward the party that was already in full, glittering motion, the DJ now playing something that had gotten a third of the guests onto the dance floor, the champagne flowing, the food arriving from the New York caterers in courses that were each more impressive than the last. He walked back into all of it, and he picked up his smile from where he had left it, and he wore it for the next 3 hours with a consistency that fooled most people, most of the time, which is to say that he was very good at it, and it cost him a great deal. What he did not know, what he could not have known, standing in that corridor watching Camille walk away, was that the day was not over. That Camille's departure through the exit was not an ending, but a pause. That she had not, in fact, left the hotel. That she had gone upstairs to room 214 and had dinner sent up and had taken off her heels and had sat at the small writing desk by the window and opened her laptop and had begun a series of actions that she had been planning, quietly and without urgency, for 6 weeks, since the invitation arrived, since she had sat with it for 3 days and felt the clarity and said yes and begun making arrangements. Not arrangements for the wedding, arrangements for what came after. Camille Renee Washington had not come to Marcus's wedding to be seen. She had not come to perform her own recovery or demonstrate her composure or make a statement. With her dress and her bodyguards, though all of those things had occurred and were observed and would be discussed in Atlanta's black professional community for weeks afterward, she had come because the invitation had given her something she needed. Not emotionally, not personally, but practically. It had given her a date, a location, a gathering of 400 of the most connected, most influential people in Atlanta's business and social world, and she had spent 6 weeks making very, very careful use of that information. The laptop opened. The city was gold through the window. Room 214 was quiet and unhurried, lit by the late afternoon sun and the small lamp on the desk. Camille scrolled through her emails with efficient attention, confirming 3 things that her assistant had managed over the past week and that were now, as of tonight, in motion. She read each confirmation carefully. She replied to each with a single brief acknowledgement. Then she closed the laptop and picked up the bourbon from the marble counter, still untouched, from that morning, and stood at the window and looked out at Atlanta and drank it slowly. Below her, the wedding reception continued. The music moved through the building's bones. She could feel it faintly, a rhythmic, distant pulse, like a heartbeat 2 rooms away. She listened to it without sentiment and without contempt. She simply let it be what it was, a party, a celebration, a man's carefully constructed triumph. And she stood at the window and finished the bourbon and thought about the next morning, when Atlanta would wake up and the work would begin, and Marcus Dillon's very carefully constructed world would begin, quietly and irrevocably, to change. She set down the glass. She looked at the city. She said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said in a room by herself on a Saturday evening in October. Everything that needed saying had already been set in motion. All she had to do now was wait. Downstairs the music played. The champagne poured. The 400 guests danced and ate and laughed and told each other what a beautiful wedding it had been. Marcus Dillon danced with his wife and smiled and received toasts and thanked guests and performed the full, generous role of a man who has everything he wanted, and he did it well, because Marcus Dillon had always been good at performance when it mattered. But somewhere beneath the performance, beneath the suit and the smile and the champagne and the applause, the hollow was still there, unchanged, patient, waiting for the quieter moment that would come when the music stopped. And the guests went home, and the lights came down, and there was nothing left between Marcus Dillon and the truth of what he had done and what it had cost and what was coming. That moment was not yet here, but it was close. It was coming the way October evenings come in Atlanta, quietly, with the fading of light so gradual you almost don't notice it until suddenly it is dark, and the warmth that was in the air all afternoon is simply gone, replaced by something cooler and more serious, and you realize that the whole time you were standing in the warmth, the evening was already on its way. The reception wound down after midnight. The last guests left. The caterers packed. The florists began dismantling the orchids and the burgundy roses. Marcus and Dominique rode up in the elevator to the honeymoon suite on the top floor, hand in hand, both of them tired in the particular, satisfied way of people who have survived a large and successful event. Dominique leaned her head on his shoulder in the elevator and closed her eyes. Marcus held her hand and looked at the elevator doors and thought about nothing, or tried to. The elevator passed the 2nd floor. Marcus looked at the number above the doors as it lit up briefly and went dark. Again, 2, room 214. He said nothing. He held his wife's hand. The elevator continued upward, carrying them both away from the 2nd floor, away from the gold dress and the pearls and the bourbon on the marble counter, away from the woman who had looked at him from the 5th row with compassion and told him to get back to his wife, and was now sitting in her room with her laptop and her plans and her 6 weeks of careful, quiet preparation, away from all of it, upward, into the honeymoon suite, into the beginning of everything he had worked for, and into the beginning of everything he was about to lose. The morning after a wedding has a quality that no other morning quite replicates. It carries the specific, peculiar silence of a space that held 400 people and enormous music and the full, ceremonial weight of a significant occasion, and now holds nothing but the evidence, the dismantled floral arrangements, the champagne flutes collected in plastic trays by the catering staff, the slight indentations in the carpet where chairs sat for hours, the particular quality of air in a room, that has been breathed in by a crowd and has not yet recovered its neutrality. Marcus Dillon woke at 6:17 on the morning of Sunday, October the 15th, in the honeymoon suite of the Grandeur Hall Hotel, and lay in the quiet for a moment before the full inventory of the previous day assembled itself in his mind, with the unhurried, methodical completeness of a balance sheet being rendered. Dominique was still asleep beside him, her breathing slow and even, her face carrying the uncomplicated peace of a woman who had had a good day and a good night and was sleeping the sleep of someone with a clear conscience. Marcus looked at her for a moment with the full, uncomplicated tenderness that he did feel for her. That was real and not performed, and then he looked at the ceiling and began the inventory, the ceremony, the vows, Pastor Graves's words about presence and practice, the fifth row, the gold dress, the bodyguards, the corridor conversation. Congratulations, Marcus. I mean that. And then, underneath all of it, the hollow, which had survived the reception, and the toasts and the dancing, and the champagne, and was still there this morning, undiminished, waiting. He got up carefully, not wanting to disturb Dominique, and moved to the window of the suite. The city was just beginning to light itself into the day, the skyline shifting from grey to gold in the particular way of early Atlanta mornings that he had watched from this building many times before, since it was partially his building, since he had sat in the financing meetings and walked the construction site and reviewed the architectural drawings and made the decisions that had brought this glass and marble into existence. He knew this building. He had made it. And standing at its window in the early morning of the day after his wedding, wearing the white hotel robe with the embossed monogram, he felt like a stranger in it. He picked up his phone from the nightstand. There were 37 congratulatory messages he had not yet read, arriving from various corners of his life throughout the previous evening, and 3 missed calls from his mother, who had left the reception early because her knees were bothering her and had apparently wanted to talk before she drove back to Mechanicsville. He would call her back. He would read the messages. He would perform the normal, warm, socially expected responses of a man who has just had the best day of his life. But first, and before he could stop himself, he opened his photo app and found the photograph Darnell had sent him the previous morning at the one of the foyer, the gold dress, the 2 suited men on either side of her, and he looked at it again in the early morning, light with the same attention he had given it the first time, except that now it meant something different than it had meant then. Then it had meant surprise. It had meant the disruption of his expectation, the appearance of something he had not planned for in a day he had planned completely. Now the morning after it meant something else. It meant a question he had not yet been willing to fully form, which was this: what exactly had Camille Washington come to his wedding to do? Not the gold dress, not the composure, not even the bodyguards, which could be explained by the practical reality of a successful woman attending a high-profile event where she would be conspicuous and possibly uncomfortable. Not any of those surface things. What had she actually come to do? Because the woman he had known for 11 years, and the woman he had observed across the ceremony hall yesterday, and the woman who had looked at him in the corridor with that settled, completed warmth, was not a woman who did things without intention. Camille Washington had always been the most purposeful person in any room, and she had come to his wedding on purpose, with bodyguards in a gold dress, and she had stayed the night before, and she had sat in the 5th row, and she had spoken to him briefly and graciously and left. And then she had gone back upstairs to room 214, and as far as Marcus knew, she was still there. He put the phone down. He told himself he was thinking too much. He told himself this was what therapy had warned him about, the tendency to assign meaning to things that did not require it, to see patterns where there were none, to remain even after doing the work, in the old habit of making Camille the center of his analysis when she no longer had any claim on that position. He told himself all of this with conviction, and then he picked up the phone again and opened his email. And the first message he saw, sent at 11:47 the previous evening, while the reception was still in its final hour, was from his attorney, Charles Whitfield, and its subject line read, "Urgent, Dillon Capital Group." Marcus stared at the subject line. Charles Whitfield did not send emails with the word urgent on a Saturday evening unless the matter was genuinely specifically urgent. Marcus had worked with Charles for 7 years and could count the number of genuinely urgent Saturday evening emails on one hand, and each of them had been attached to a real and significant event. He opened the email. He read it. He read it again. Then he sat down on the edge of the window seat with the phone in both hands and read it a third time, slowly, giving each sentence the careful individual attention that it deserved, because each sentence deserved a great deal of attention. The email was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph established that Charles had been contacted on Saturday afternoon by 3 separate parties, 2 of them representing significant institutional investors in Dillon Capital Group's current flagship development, the Harmon Street mixed-use project in Midtown Atlanta, and one of them representing a partner firm whose backing was essential to the project's Phase 2 financing. The second paragraph established that all 3 parties had raised concerns, formal, documented, attorney-represented concerns, about specific elements of the Harmon Street project's financial structure, concerns that Charles described as substantive and coordinated, and that had arrived, with notable timing, within a 6-hour window on a Saturday afternoon. The third paragraph noted that the nature and specificity of the concerns suggested that whoever had raised them was in possession of detailed internal financial information about the project, information that was not public, that was not available through any standard due diligence channel, and that would have required either a significant data breach or the deliberate provision of documents by someone with authorized access. The fourth paragraph said, "Marcus, I need to speak with you first thing Monday morning, and I want you to think carefully before then about who, within your organization or immediate professional circle, would have both the access and the motive to do this." Marcus put the phone down on the window seat beside him. He looked at the city. The gold was fully in the sky now, the October morning opening up clear and warm and indifferent. He sat very still. He thought about the word coordinated. He thought about the 6-hour window on Saturday afternoon. He thought about what had been happening on Saturday afternoon, the reception, the champagne, the toasts, the dancing, the 400 guests, the music moving through the building's bones. He thought about room 214 and the laptop and the untouched bourbon. He thought about 6 weeks. 6 weeks of careful, quiet preparation. He thought about the invitation he had sent and the note he had written. "I want you to see who I've become." And he thought about the response, which had not been what he expected in any dimension, and which he now understood, sitting on the edge of the window seat in his white hotel robe in the early morning of the day after his wedding, was not a social response at all. His phone rang. It was Darnell. He answered it. "Have you checked your email?" Darnell said. His voice had the quality of a man who has not slept. "Yes," Marcus said. "Charles called me 20 minutes ago. He couldn't reach you last night. I was at my own wedding reception, Darnell." "I know that." "Marcus." A pause. "He thinks it's coordinated. He thinks someone fed information to multiple parties simultaneously and timed it to hit on the day you were unavailable and distracted." Marcus said nothing. "He wants to know who had access to the Harmon Street financial documents. Internal access, not board level, operational level. Project managers, financial directors, people inside the structure." "I know what internal access means," Marcus said. Another pause, longer this time. When Darnell spoke again, his voice had the particular, careful weight of a man approaching something he has been circling for several minutes. "Marcus, was there anyone outside the company who might have had access? Someone you trusted at a time, when maybe the boundaries between professional and personal were less—" "Stop," Marcus said. Silence. "Don't finish that sentence," Marcus said. His voice was level. It was the voice he used in negotiating rooms when someone had put something on the table that he needed to control his reaction to. "I'm just asking what Charles is going to ask," Darnell said. "I know what you're asking." Marcus stood up. He walked to the window and stood in front of it, looking at the city. Camille hasn't had access to Dillon Capital Group's financials since the divorce. The divorce agreement was explicit. All shared business interests were liquidated and separated. She has no access. She had access for 11 years, Marcus. She understood the business as well as anyone. She knew the investors. She knew the partners. She knew how you structured deals. You used to run things by her before the company was large enough for a board. She knew how I structured deals 3 years ago, Marcus said. The Harmon Street project didn't exist 3 years ago. No, Darnell said slowly. But the investors did. Some of them. And the partner firms. The relationships she would have known. The people who would have been susceptible to a well-placed conversation from someone credible, someone who understood the architecture of how you work. Marcus was quiet. The city was fully gold now, the morning established and indifferent. "You invited her to the wedding, Marcus," Darnell said. "You gave her a reason to be in the same building as 400 of your most important contacts on the same day. You were completely occupied with the ceremony and the reception and your new wife. You gave her a stage, man. You designed the stage and sent her a personal invitation and wrote her a note in your own handwriting. And she came," Marcus said. "She came prepared," Darnell said. The line was quiet for a long time after that. Marcus stood at the window and looked at Atlanta and breathed. Behind him, from the bed, he heard Dominique shift in her sleep. A small sound, barely audible, the sound of someone turning toward warmth. He did not turn around. He stood at the window and he thought about, "I want you to see who I've become," and about how a sentence can be sent in one direction and received in an entirely different one, and about how Camille had always been better at reading rooms than he was, had always understood the full architecture of a situation. While he was still studying the floor plan, he thought about 11 years of watching him build, 11 years of understanding exactly how Marcus Dillon constructed things, the sequence, the dependencies, the pressure points, the relationships that everything else rested on. 11 years of being his closest confidant, and then 3 years of watching him from the outside, and then 6 weeks between the invitation and the wedding, 6 weeks in which a woman of her intelligence and capability and access could do a great deal with information she had held in her memory for years. He had invited her to see who he had become. He had not considered that she already knew, that she had, in some important sense, helped build who he had become, and therefore understood its structure from the inside, and that this understanding was not something that a divorce agreement could liquidate and separate. It lived in her. It was hers, and he had handed her a date and a location, and a gathering of 400 of the most important people in his professional world, and told her, in his own handwriting, that he wanted her to see it. He had not given her a gift. He had given her a weapon, and she had arrived at his wedding dressed for exactly the occasion he had created. "What do I do?" he said. The question came out quieter than he intended, stripped of the controlled negotiating room register, and Darnell heard the difference and was silent for a moment before responding. "You call Charles first thing Monday," Darnell said. "You find out exactly what was communicated to the investors and the partner firm, and you assess the actual damage, because right now we don't know if this is serious or if it can be managed. It might be manageable, Marcus. Financial concerns raised by a third party don't automatically derail a project. It depends on what was said, how it was framed, what documentation was provided. And if documentation was provided?" Another silence. "Then it gets more complicated." Marcus turned from the window. He looked at the room, the honeymoon suite, the white linens, the champagne bottle from the previous night standing empty on the console table, the orchid arrangement that the hotel had placed there as a wedding gift. Dominique sleeping in the center of the bed with the uncomplicated peace of a woman who did not yet know that the Morning had a different texture than she had fallen asleep expecting. He looked at all of it, the beautiful, expensive, carefully constructed evidence of his triumph, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt afraid, not the manageable, strategic fear of a man who has encountered a business problem that requires a solution. The older, deeper, less manageable fear of a man who has done something he cannot undo and is beginning to understand the full shape of its consequences. He went to the bathroom. He closed the door softly. He ran the shower hot and stood under it for a long time without moving. The water ran over him and he let it. He thought about the Harmon Street project, $340 million of development, 18 months of negotiation, 6 anchor tenants, 2 institutional investors whose combined commitment represented the financial spine of Phase 2, a partner firm whose backing he had spent 14 months securing. He thought about what it would mean if those relationships were destabilized, not destroyed. Darnell was right that it might be manageable, but destabilized, which in the world of high-stakes real estate development meant delays, renegotiations, the specific kind of vulnerability that other developers could exploit, that the market could exploit, that one bad quarter could turn from a setback into a collapse. He thought about the phone call he would make to Charles on Monday morning. He thought about the questions Charles would ask. He thought about the questions he would not be able to answer, because the answers to those questions led back to an invitation he had sent 6 weeks ago for reasons he had told himself were about closure and could not honestly be described that way anymore. He turned off the shower. He stood in the steam. He made the only decision available to him, which was the decision to get through the rest of the morning, through breakfast with Dominique, through the checkout, through the drive to the airport for the honeymoon flight to Santorini that he had booked 6 months ago, without telling her what was in Charles's email, not because he intended to keep it from her permanently, but because today was still, in its official capacity, the morning after their wedding, and she deserved at least the full duration of that morning in its uncomplicated form. He owed her that. He could give her that. Monday was coming soon enough. He dried off. He got dressed in the clothes he had brought for the next morning. He opened the bathroom door and found Dominique sitting up in bed, her hair loose, her face warm with sleep, smiling at him in the way that she smiled in private, without the particular social composure she wore in public, with just the real version of her warmth, unguarded and direct. "Good morning, husband," she said, and the word landed on him with a weight he accepted and a weight he carried, both at the same time. "Good morning," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took her hand. He looked at her face and held on to what was real and true in front of him, which was real and true, which was not enough this morning to displace what was also real and true, which was the email on his phone and the question Darnell had not finished asking, and the 6-hour window on Saturday afternoon and room 214 and the woman inside it with her laptop and her plans and her 6 weeks of careful, quiet preparation. But he held Dominique's hand, and he said, with a steadiness that cost him everything it cost him, "How did you sleep?" And she told him, and he listened. And the morning moved around them, indifferent and golden, the way Atlanta mornings always moved, without ceremony, without warning, and without any particular concern for what they were carrying. 3 floors below, in room 214, the bed had already been made. The bourbon glass had been rinsed and placed precisely on the marble counter. The laptop was in its case. The gold dress was folded in tissue in the garment bag. Camille Washington had checked out at 6 o'clock. While the hotel was still quiet, and the corridors still held the thick, undisturbed silence of early morning, she had tipped the porter generously. She had walked through the lobby without looking back. She had gotten into the black SUV where Gerald was, already waiting, and had settled into the back seat and looked out at the city through the tinted window as they pulled onto the street. She had said nothing on the drive back to her Buckhead condo. Gerald, who was professionally accustomed to silence and personally attuned to the difference between its varieties, had said nothing either. The city had moved past the window in its Sunday morning state. Quiet, unhurried, the streets carrying only the essential. Traffic of people going to church or coming home from overnight shifts or walking dogs in the October cool. Atlanta in its Sunday morning form. Ordinary and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to what had happened inside the grandeur hall the previous day. Camille had watched it pass. She had thought about Marcus's face in the corridor, the searching, the confusion, the moment when he had reached for the script he had prepared and found it inadequate to the reality in front of him. She had thought about the vows she had heard from the fifth row, which had been genuine. She had heard enough of Marcus Dillon's voice across enough years to know the difference between his true register and his performed register, and the vows had been true. She had felt something during them that she had not quite anticipated. Not grief, not longing, but something adjacent. The particular, bittersweet recognition of a person watching someone they once loved be fully present in a moment, finally, when presence had always been the thing that cost them everything. Marcus Dillon, saying his vows to another woman, had been more fully present than she had seen him in the last 3 years of their marriage. She had felt the irony of that land on her quietly, and she had let it land, and she had let it pass, because she was done processing Marcus Dillon on his behalf. The SUV had pulled up to her building. She had gone upstairs. She had made coffee. She had stood at the window with the coffee and watched Buckhead wake up below her, and she had thought, not about Marcus, not about the wedding, not about the gold dress or the corridor or the fifth row, but about Monday morning, and about the 3 phone calls she needed to make, and about the future that was already in motion, already underway, already beyond the point where any invitation, or any wedding, or any carefully constructed act of vengeance could touch it. She thought about what her grandmother, who had been a woman of considerable wisdom and very few wasted words, had always said about people who try to use your presence against you. She had said, "Baby, let them set the stage. You just make sure you know your own lines." Camille had known her lines for 6 weeks. She had delivered them with precision and without drama and without any of the emotion that Marcus had been counting on. And now it was Sunday morning, and the coffee was good, and the city was ordinary and beautiful, and the work that mattered, the real work, the work that had nothing to do with Marcus Dillon's wedding or his ego or his invitation, was waiting for Monday. She finished her coffee. She set down the cup. She went to her desk. She opened her laptop. And Camille Washington, who had once shared cereal, dinners in a thin-walled apartment, and left handwritten notes on kitchen counters for a man too busy to be present, and who had walked away from that marriage with a steady hand and built something extraordinary in the years since, began her Sunday the way she began every Sunday, with purpose, with discipline, and with the quiet, grounded energy of a woman who has nothing left to prove and everything still to build. Monday morning in Atlanta arrives with a particular kind of business. Not the lazy, reluctant morning of a city still shaking off the weekend, but the forward-leaning, purposeful energy of a place that has always understood that money moves early and waits for no one, that the deals are being made before the coffee is finished, that the phone calls that matter are already in motion before most people have decided what to wear. Marcus Dillon had always loved Monday mornings for exactly this reason. He had built his career on Monday mornings, on being the first person in the room and the last to leave it, on treating the beginning of each week as a fresh negotiation with the future. Monday mornings had always felt like his. They had always felt like advantage. This Monday morning felt like none of those things. He was in Charles Whitfield's office on the 22nd floor of the Whitfield Associates building on Peachtree Street at 8 o'clock sharp, which was 30 minutes before Charles's assistant had told him to come, and which meant he sat in the reception area for those 30 minutes with a cup of coffee he did not drink and his phone face down on his knee, watching the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows with the controlled stillness of a man managing something large and unwilling. He had told Dominique before he left the hotel that morning They had stayed the extra night, delaying the Santorini flight by 1 day, which he had explained to her as a logistical issue with the connection, which was not true, that he needed to handle one business matter before they left. She had looked at him with the particular, measuring attention of a woman who is intelligent enough to know when she's not being told everything, but who has also just gotten married and is, in the generous and temporary way of new marriages, choosing to extend trust in full. She had said okay. She had kissed him. He had left. He had not told her about Charles's email. He had carried it alone through Sunday, through the breakfast, in the suite and the extended checkout and the rebooked flights, through the dinner they had in the hotel restaurant that evening, where Dominique had been warm and funny and entirely herself, telling him about a surgical case she had closed the week before with the focused, animated clarity she brought to her work. And he had listened and responded, and been as present as he could manage with Charles's email running in the background of his mind, like an open program consuming processing power. He had told himself he would tell her after the Monday morning meeting, once he knew the actual shape of the damage, once he had something concrete to report rather than a set of implications that he was not yet ready to speak aloud. Charles Whitfield appeared in the reception doorway at 8:27 and looked at Marcus with the expression of a man who has had a difficult weekend and is about to make it someone else's difficult Monday. Charles was 61 years old, a former federal prosecutor who had moved into private practice 20 years ago and had built one of the most respected commercial law firms in Atlanta with the methodical, patient ferocity of a man who fundamentally understood that the law is simply the formal architecture of power, and that architecture requires maintenance. He was Marcus's attorney in the full, comprehensive sense, corporate, contractual, and occasionally personal, and he had seen Marcus in most of the configurations that a man of Marcus's ambition and complexity could produce. He had never looked at Marcus the way he looked at him this Monday morning, which was with a combination of professional gravity and something that, in a less controlled man, might have registered as pity. "Come in," Charles said. Marcus came in. He sat down across from Charles's desk, which was the kind of desk that communicated seriousness. Dark wood, clear surface, nothing on it that was not intentional. Charles closed the door. He sat down. He opened a folder. He looked at Marcus. "Tell me what you know first," Charles said. "Before I tell you what I know." This was Charles's standard approach in serious meetings, establishing the client's baseline before introducing new information, so that the attorney understands the gap and the client cannot later claim they were not given the opportunity to be fully transparent before counsel. Marcus knew the approach. He had sat across this desk in enough significant moments to understand the protocol. He told Charles what he knew, which was what the email had told him. 3 parties, coordinated concerns, Saturday afternoon, internal financial information. Charles listened without interrupting. Then he opened the folder and laid 3 documents on the desk, spreading them apart with the deliberate, even spacing of a man presenting evidence. "This is what was communicated to the 2 institutional investors," Charles said, indicating the first 2 documents. "And this is what was communicated to the partner firm." He indicated the third. Each communication was delivered by a different attorney representing a different unnamed client. All 3 attorneys are real, credentialed, and unconnected to each other in any professional capacity, which tells us that whoever orchestrated this was careful about the delivery mechanism, using separate counsels so there is no obvious common thread between the 3 communications. Marcus looked at the documents. He read them. He read them carefully, the way Charles had laid them out, one at a time, completely before moving to the next. They were formal legal communications, dense and precise, and they each raised specific, documented concerns about the financial structure of the Harmon Street project. Not general concerns, not vague allegations, specific numbered sourced concerns about specific elements of the project's Phase 2 financing, concerns that demonstrated a detailed, operational-level understanding of the project's structure, its dependencies, its vulnerabilities, and the exact points at which external scrutiny could produce maximum disruption with minimum obvious provocation. Marcus finished reading the third document. He placed it back on the desk. He looked at Charles. "The information in these documents," Charles said, "is not publicly available. It is not accessible through standard due diligence. It reflects an understanding of the project's financial architecture. That would require either a data breach, and our forensic team found no evidence of a breach, or the deliberate provision of information by a source with direct operational knowledge of the project." "Someone inside the company," Marcus said. "Not necessarily inside the company," Charles said, and his voice had the careful, precise quality of a man delivering a distinction that matters. "Someone with knowledge of the company, knowledge of how you structure projects, knowledge of the investors and partners, specifically knowledge of which investors and partners would be most responsive to which categories of concern. The three communications are not identical, Marcus. Each one is calibrated to the specific sensitivities of its recipient. Investor A's concerns are framed around regulatory compliance. Investor B's concerns are framed around environmental liability. The partner firm's concerns are framed around fiduciary exposure. Whoever provided the information understood not just the project structure but the psychological and institutional profile of each recipient well enough to tailor the framing accordingly. Marcus was quiet. The room was quiet. 22 floors below, Peachtree Street was in full Monday morning motion. "That level of calibration," Charles continued, "suggests someone who has been in the room, not recently necessarily, but someone who was present for long enough and paid close enough attention and retained enough detailed understanding of your professional relationships and your business methodology to be able to construct targeted communications 3 years after the fact." Marcus looked at the documents on the desk. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the early years, before the company was large enough for a board, when he would sit at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings and talk through deals with Camille, not because he needed her approval or her expertise, but because she was the sharpest person he knew and her questions always found the structural weakness he had missed. He thought about the investors he had brought to dinner at their home in those years, the partners who had become family friends, the professional relationships that had been built partly inside the warmth of a shared domestic life. He thought about Camille sitting across those dinner tables, listening, asking questions, remembering, always remembering. He had loved that about her. He had relied on it. He had, in the early years of the company, been in the habit of saying, half-jokingly to colleagues and partners, that Camille was his best advisor. He had meant it as a compliment. He had not understood, until this Monday morning in Charles Whitfield's office, that it was also a precise description of a liability. "What is the actual damage?" Marcus said. His voice was the negotiating room voice, controlled and flat. It was the only voice he had available right now that he trusted. Charles leaned back slightly. "Investor A has requested an emergency review meeting before confirming their Phase 2 commitment. They have not withdrawn, but they have paused. Investor B has done the same. The partner firm is gone. Further, they have formally requested a 30-day extension on the Phase 2 closing, which effectively freezes the project's financing timeline and creates a window during which other interested parties could potentially approach either investor with alternative proposals." "Competitors," Marcus said. "Specifically," Charles said, "DevCore Capital, who has been circling the Midtown corridor for 8 months and who would benefit substantially from a delay in the Harmon Street timeline." Marcus thought about DevCore Capital. He thought about Raymond Osei, DevCore's founder, a man he had competed against twice in the past 4 years and beaten both times, and who had made no particular secret of his interest in the Midtown corridor development market. He thought about $340 million and 18 months of negotiation and 6 anchor tenants, and the Phase 2 financing that was now sitting in a 30-day freeze because 3 carefully calibrated legal communications had arrived in 3 separate inboxes on a Saturday afternoon in October while Marcus Dillon was dancing at his own wedding reception. "Can we recover?" Marcus said. "Yes," Charles said, "but not quickly and not cheaply and not without effort. The review meetings with both investors will need to happen this week, in person, with full documentation, with you present and in command of every detail of the project's structure. You will need to demonstrate not only that the concerns raised are unfounded, but that you have the full confidence and transparency required of a project lead whose integrity has been questioned. The partner firm will need to be handled separately and carefully, and we will need to move quickly, because the 30-day window is a real window, and DevCore knows it." Marcus nodded. He filed each item with the automatic efficiency of a man who has managed crises before and knows that the path through them is always the same. Identify the damage, identify the recovery sequence, execute the sequence with discipline, do not look sideways. He had done this before in smaller configurations. He could do it now. The project was not lost. The relationships were not irreparable. He had handled worse. He told himself all of this. And then Charles said, "Marcus, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly, because it is going to affect how I advise you on the next steps." "Ask," Marcus said. "Did you invite Camille Washington to your wedding?" The room was very still. Marcus looked at Charles for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." Charles absorbed this without expression. "And she attended." "She attended. And she was present in the hotel and the venue on Saturday, while 400 of your professional contacts were also present, and while you were unavailable to monitor or manage any interactions she may have had." "Yes." Charles closed the folder on his desk. He did not say anything for a moment. He was the kind of man who used silence with precision as a tool rather than a gap. And Marcus waited through the silence with the particular discipline of a man who knows he deserves whatever is coming. "Marcus," Charles said finally, and his voice had shifted from the formal, evidentiary register into something older and more direct. "Why did you invite her?" And there it was. The question that Darnell had not finished asking on the phone. The question that Marcus had been not answering since Saturday morning in the groom's suite. The question that had been circling him for 6 weeks, since he had dropped the envelope in the mail slot, and that he had answered to himself with a series of explanations, closure, dignity, the magnanimity of a healed man, that he now understood were not so much answers as cover stories. Stories he had told himself in order to avoid the real answer, which was simpler and smaller and less flattering than any of them. He had wanted to hurt her. That was the truth. Not in the violent or vindictive sense, not with any intention of lasting damage, but in the small, human, deeply understandable sense of wanting someone who had made you feel insufficient to witness your sufficiency. He had wanted Camille to sit in that hall and look at the flowers, and the marble and the 400 guests, and the woman he had married, and feel, in some private interior space, the sting of what she had walked away from. He had wanted to be the thing she had underestimated. He had wanted the moment of her recognition to be its own kind of payment for the steady hand and the clear expression and the composure in the mediator's office. He had wanted to make her feel something that matched what she had made him feel, and he had dressed it up as closure because he was too proud to call it by its real name. He did not say all of this to Charles. He said, "I thought it was about closure. I was wrong about what it was about." Charles looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the quiet, judicial acceptance of a man who has heard a great many confessions across a great many desks and knows the sound of a real one. "All right," he said. "Then here is what we are going to do." The meeting lasted 2 more hours. When Marcus walked out of Charles Whitfield's building onto Peachtree Street at 10:45 in the Monday morning sun, he had a recovery plan, a meeting schedule, a list of calls to make, and the particular weight of a man who has been fully honest with someone for the first time in several weeks and found that honesty, while necessary, does not immediately reduce the weight of what produced it. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around him. He thought about calling Dominique, and then he thought about what he would say, and he took out his phone and looked at it and put it back in his pocket. He thought about calling Darnell. He took a breath. He looked up at the sky, which was clear and blue and October sharp. The kind of sky that makes Atlanta look, briefly, like a city that has its whole future in front of it. Then he did something he had not done in 3 years, something he had not planned to do, something that was almost certainly inadvisable, and that Charles would have counseled against if Marcus had mentioned it, which he had not. He looked up Camille Washington's office address, Renata Washington Consulting, Buckhead, which he had not known the address of, but which took approximately 30 seconds to find, because Camille had built the kind of company that had a professional digital presence that matched its ambition. He looked at the address. He looked at the distance on the map. He put the phone in his pocket. He walked to his car. He was not going to threaten her. He was not going to negotiate with her. He was not going to try to undo what had been done, because Charles had been clear that the path through this situation did not run through Camille Washington, and that any direct contact with her at this stage was legally inadvisable. He knew all of that. He drove toward Buckhead anyway with the specific, irrational momentum of a man who has spent too long managing everything strategically and needs, in this one moment, to do something direct. Not smart, not strategic, direct. He arrived at her building. He sat in the car in the parking structure for 4 minutes. He got out. He went through the lobby. He told the front desk he was there to see Camille Washington. He gave his name. He expected to be told she was unavailable, expected the quiet, professional deflection that assistants are trained to produce for unwanted visitors. Instead, after a brief phone call, the receptionist looked up at him and said, "She'll see you." 10th floor. Marcus stood very still for a moment. Then he pressed the elevator button. The elevator opened. He got in. The doors closed. He watched the floor numbers rise. He thought about what he was going to say, which he did not know, which was the first time in a professional context that Marcus Dillon had arrived somewhere without knowing what he was going to say. And the unfamiliarity of it moved through him like the early edge of something large. The doors opened on the 10th floor. The office was everything her firm's website had suggested. Clean, serious, well-designed. The particular aesthetic of a company that wants to communicate competence without ostentation. There was a receptionist, a waiting area with 2 low chairs and a glass table and fresh flowers, and a corridor beyond that. At the end of the corridor, a door was open. Through the open door, backlit by the Buckhead morning through a large window, Camille Washington sat at her desk. She was in a cream-colored blazer. Her hair was up. She was looking directly at the elevator as the doors opened, as if she had known exactly when he would arrive, which Marcus now understood with a cold and complete clarity she quite possibly had. She looked at him across the length of the corridor. She did not stand. She did not smile. She simply looked at him with the same composed, arrived expression she had worn from the 5th row and in the corridor at the Grandeur Hall, and she said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet office, "Come in, Marcus." He walked down the corridor. He entered her office. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, the chair that was there. That had been prepared. That was the right height and the right distance, perfectly positioned, as if it had been waiting for him. He looked at her. She looked at him. The city was behind her through the window. The Monday morning continued below them, indifferent and golden. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again and said the only thing that was actually true, "I didn't come here to fight." "I know," she said. And then, after the briefest pause, in the voice that was still, infuriatingly, exactly as he remembered it, "What did you come here for, Marcus?" The question settled in the room between them like something physical, not hostile, not sharp, but substantial, taking up space the way significant, Things always do when they are finally spoken aloud after a long time of being carried in silence. Marcus looked at Camille across the desk and understood, in the particular way that a man understands things when he has run out of the comfortable distance that strategy provides, that he did not have a clean answer. He had driven here on momentum and honesty and the specific exhaustion of a man who has been managing the gap between what he has done and what he has told himself about what he has done. And now he was in the room, and the question was in the air, and Camille was looking at him with that complete, patient attention, and he had nothing prepared. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Marcus Dillon had nothing prepared. "I don't entirely know," he said. And because that was the truest thing available, he stayed with it rather than reaching for something more constructed. "I know I'm not here to threaten you. I know I'm not here to ask you to undo anything. I know my attorney would tell me this visit is inadvisable, and he would be right." He paused. "I think I came because I needed to look at you directly. Not from across a ceremony hall, not in a corridor with 400 people moving around us. Directly." Camille held his gaze. She had her hands folded on the desk in front of her, not rigidly, not defensively, but with the composed, deliberate stillness of a woman who is fully present in a conversation and is in no hurry to move it along faster than it needs to move. "All right," she said. "Look." He looked. He looked at her face, the strong jaw, the clear eyes, the set of her mouth that he had known across 11 years in every register, in joy and exhaustion and frustration and tenderness and grief. He looked at the person across the desk who was and was not the person he had been married to, who had been changed by 3 years and by the specific, demanding work of rebuilding a life from a voluntary dissolution, and who wore those changes with the settled confidence of someone who has done the hardest work privately and is not seeking acknowledgement for it. He looked at her, and he thought about everything he had planned to make her feel on Saturday, all the small human, understandable cruelties he had designed and dressed in the language of closure, and he felt them fall away from him now with a completeness that surprised him. "I owe you an apology," he said. Camille was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her eyes, not surprise exactly, but the particular attentiveness of someone recalibrating slightly. "For which part?" she said. "For the invitation," he said. "Specifically for the note. I want you to see who I've become." I told myself it was about closure. It wasn't about closure. "No," she said. "It wasn't. It was about wanting you to feel something that would match what I felt when you left," he said. "That's all it was. I dressed it up better than that for myself, but that's all it was." A silence. Outside, a car horn on the street below. The ordinary Monday morning sounds of Buckhead conducting its business beneath them. "I know that's what it was," Camille said. Her voice was not unkind. It was not the voice of a woman scoring a point. It was the voice of a woman stating a fact that she had understood for 6 weeks and had not needed him to confirm, but was receiving the confirmation of with a certain quiet, private relief at its honesty. "I knew that's what it was when the invitation arrived. That's actually why I said yes." Marcus looked at her. "Why?" She unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the desk, a small change in posture that communicated openness rather than containment. "Because when someone sends you an invitation designed to diminish you," she said carefully, "you have 2 options. You can decline, which protects you but also confirms that they still have the power to determine your presence or absence. Or you can accept, which removes that power entirely, but only if you arrive on your own terms rather than theirs." He was quiet. He was listening with his full attention, the way he listened in rooms, where the information being delivered was the most important information in the room. "You designed a role for me in that ceremony," she said. "Humbled ex-wife, evidence of the life you'd transcended. I understood the role, and I decided very simply that I was not going to play it. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that. Not to hurt you or make a statement, just because it wasn't my role to play. I know who I am. I built who I am in the 3 years since our divorce, And I did it without an audience and without anyone's validation. And I was not going to walk into a room of 400 people and perform someone else's idea of what I am. The dress, Marcus said slowly. A brief, genuine warmth moved across her face. The first real smile she had shown him in any of their interactions since the divorce, small and unguarded, the way smiles are when they are responding to the recognition of something true. The dress was just a dress, she said. A very good dress. And the bodyguards? Gerald and Thomas work for me professionally. I am a black woman who runs an 8-figure consulting firm in a city that pays close attention to that firm's every move. Personal security at a high-profile public event is not theatre, Marcus. It is a practical decision. He absorbed this. He thought about the photograph Darnell had sent him, the one he had enlarged on his phone in the groom's suite, the one he had interpreted as a statement, as a performance, as Camille arriving armed. He thought about how completely he had filtered what he saw through what he had expected to see, and how that filtering had told him a story about the moment that was not the moment's actual story. The other thing, he said it carefully, the way you say the thing you have been building toward when you finally reach it. The investors, the partner firm. Camille looked at him with the same composed, clear expression. She said nothing. I need to understand, he said. Not aggressively, not with the accusatory register of a man making a legal claim. With the direct, stripped-down honesty of a man asking a real question that he needs a real answer to. Not for Charles, not for any legal purpose. For myself. Did you coordinate those communications? The silence that followed was not the silence of a person deciding whether to lie. It was the silence of a person deciding precisely how much truth to offer and in what form. Marcus had known Camille's silences well enough across 11 years to read their varieties, and this one was the variety that preceded a careful and complete honesty. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and I want you to hear all of it before you respond, because the part you are going to want to respond to is not the most important part. All right, he said. She looked at him steadily. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, she said, I began building my own company. You know that. What you may not fully know is the specific way I built it. I did not trade on your name or your reputation or our shared history. I made a deliberate and principled decision from the beginning that Renata Washington Consulting would stand entirely on its own foundation, entirely separate from anything that had to do with Marcus Dillon or Dillon Capital Group. I kept that separation clean, and I kept it documented because I understood that there would come a time when someone might try to suggest otherwise, and I wanted the record to be unambiguous. Marcus listened. He was still. In the course of building my company, she continued, I developed professional relationships with people across Atlanta's investment and development community. Some of those people had prior relationships with you, or with Dillon Capital Group. That is the natural consequence of operating in the same professional ecosystem for over a decade. I cannot and would not attempt to wall myself off from the full Atlanta business community simply because you exist within it. Camille, he said quietly. I'm not finished, she said. He was quiet. In the course of those professional relationships, she said, I have had conversations with clients, partners, and colleagues about projects in the Midtown corridor, including the Harmon Street development. These conversations were professional, honest, and based entirely on information that is available through legitimate channels, public filings, market analyses, industry assessments. I have not shared privileged information. I have not breached any agreement. I have not done anything that my own attorneys, who are very good, would not be entirely comfortable defending. She paused. What I have done is build relationships of trust with people who make decisions about where to commit significant capital. And when those people ask me, as they sometimes do, for my honest professional assessment of a project or a developer, I give them my honest professional assessment. The room was very quiet. Marcus was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, which was unusual because she had always been able to read him. Your honest professional assessment of the Harmon Street project, he said, is that it is a good project with a solid concept, she said, being led by a developer who has demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing the expansion of his public profile over the operational depth of his financing structures, and who has in the past moved to Phase 2 commitments before fully stress testing his Phase 1 relationships. She let that land. Then she said, "That is my professional opinion. It is not a fabrication. It is not a personal attack. It is an accurate assessment based on a detailed knowledge of how you build things, which I have because I watched you build them for 11 years." Marcus was silent for a long time. He looked at the desk. He looked at his hands. He looked up at her. "You didn't do anything illegal," he said. It was not a question. "I did not do anything illegal," she confirmed. "You did it knowing what it would do to the project." "I did it knowing that it would produce scrutiny," she said carefully. "Scrutiny that the project can survive if its foundation is as solid as you believe it to be. If the concerns that have been raised are unfounded, and you believe they are unfounded, then the review meetings will demonstrate that, and the investors and the partner firm will recommit, and the project will proceed on a slightly delayed timeline with a foundation that has been tested rather than assumed." He looked at her for a long moment. "And if the foundation is not as solid as I believe it to be," she held his gaze with the clear, direct honesty that had always been her most disarming quality. "Then you should know that now," she said quietly, "before you put $340 million and 18 months of committed relationships on top of it." The silence that followed was of a different quality than any of the silences that had come before it in that office. It was not the silence of opposition. It was not the silence of a power negotiation or a confrontation. It was the silence of two people who have arrived, through a complicated and painful and inadvisable sequence of events, at a place of unexpected honesty, and are both sitting inside that honesty without quite knowing what to do with it. Marcus looked at her. He thought about the early years, the Sunday evenings at the kitchen table, the deals she had helped him see, clearly before he had the board and the attorneys, and the advisors and all the expensive scaffolding of a large company. He thought about her questions, the structural questions, the pressure point questions, the questions that found the weakness he had missed. He thought about what Charles had said, about the calibration of the 3 communications, each one tailored to the specific sensitivities of its recipient, demonstrating an understanding not just of the project structure but of the psychological and institutional profile of each party. He thought about that calibration, and he thought about Camille's mind, and he thought about the specific, painful irony of the fact that the most thorough professional assessment his project had received in 18 months had come from his ex-wife, delivered through legal proxies on the day of his wedding, because he had sent her an invitation designed to make her feel small. "Tell me what's actually wrong with the Phase 2 structure," he said. Camille looked at him. A long moment passed. He could see her assessing the question. Not whether to answer, but how to answer, which format, which level of detail, what it meant that he was asking, and what it would mean for her to respond. "That is not a conversation I should be having with you informally in my office," she said. "There are professional boundaries here that matter to both of us." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to be my advisor. I'm not asking you to save my project. I'm asking, personally, not professionally, whether you think the project is in real trouble or whether this is recoverable." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "It's recoverable. The Phase 2 structure has a specific weakness in how the environmental liability is allocated across the partner agreements, and whoever raised that concern with the partner firm identified the right pressure point. Your attorneys can address it. It will require renegotiating one clause in the partner agreement and providing additional documentation to both institutional investors. But the project's fundamentals are sound. You built it well, Marcus. You just missed a detail that the right scrutiny was always going to find." He absorbed this. He looked at the desk. He looked up. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it in every register available, which was several. She nodded. She looked at him with the completed warmth. The warmth that was not longing and not regret and not an invitation, but simply the genuine, generous feeling of a person toward someone they understood fully and had released completely. "You should go," she said. "You have a lot of work to do this week, and you have a wife who is waiting for a honeymoon." He stood up. He looked at her one more time from a standing position, from the full height of himself, in the Monday morning light in her Buckhead office. He thought about everything they had been to each other. He thought about the serial dinners, and the thin-walled apartment and the notes on the kitchen counter. He thought about Dominique saying "Good morning, husband," in the hotel room with her hair loose and her face warm. He thought about all of it together, the whole complicated, layered, interconnected weight of it, and he felt it not as a burden but as a history, something real that had happened, that had mattered, that had made him and cost him, and ultimately, through the specific, painful, inadvisable sequence of the past 6 weeks, brought him to a morning that was more honest than any morning he had inhabited in a long time. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the invitation, for what it was actually about. I'm sorry." She looked at him. "I know you are," she said. "Take care of yourself, Marcus." He walked down the corridor. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He got in. He looked back once briefly and saw her already turned back to her desk, already returned to the work that was waiting, already gone from the moment with the same ease and completeness with which she had arrived at it, as if the conversation had been a thing she moved through rather than a thing she carried. The doors closed. He rode the elevator down alone. In the lobby, Gerald Price was sitting in one of the waiting chairs near the entrance, reading something on his phone with professional calm. He looked up at Marcus as Marcus crossed the lobby. Their eyes met briefly, two men acknowledging each other across a complicated space without words. Marcus nodded. Gerald nodded. Marcus walked out into the Buckhead morning. He stood on the sidewalk. The October air was cool and clean and specific, the kind of air that makes thoughts sharper rather than softer. He took out his phone. He called Dominique. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the ordinary warmth of a woman who is not yet worried, because she does not yet have reason to be, but who is intelligent enough to be paying attention. "How did the meeting go?" she said. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building he had just come out of and thought about everything Charles had told him and everything Camille had said and everything he owed the woman on the phone. He thought about presents. He thought about the vows he had meant when he said them. He thought about the particular courage, as Pastor Graves had described it, required to choose another person, not in the easy moments, but in the hard ones. He thought about the fact that Dominique had married a man who had invited his ex-wife to their wedding without telling her, and that Dominique deserved to know that, and that he was done carrying things alone. "Dominique," he said, "the meeting was complicated. I need to tell you some things, not over the phone, tonight when I'm back. There are some things I should have told you before the wedding and I didn't, and I'm going to tell you tonight, all of it, and I need you to know before I start that I'm telling you because I am done making the choices that cost me everything I value. A silence on the line, not the silence of panic or of a relationship contracting around a threat. The silence of an intelligent woman receiving information that is more than she expected and less than she feared, processing it with the measured, surgical precision that she brought to everything difficult. Then, "Okay," she said. Her voice was careful but not cold. "Tonight." "Tonight," he confirmed. "I'll be home by 6. He hung up. He stood on the sidewalk a moment longer. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked to his car and opened the door and sat in it and looked through the windshield at the street for a long time before starting the engine. Somewhere across Buckhead, on the 10th floor of a building with fresh flowers in the waiting area, Camille Washington was on a call with her senior partner, discussing a new client acquisition that her firm had been positioning for 3 months. A technology company based in Charlotte that was looking for a strategic consulting partner as it expanded into the Southeast market. The acquisition was close. The terms were good. The relationship was strong. She was focused on the call entirely, with the particular, clean attention of a woman who has finished one thing and begun the next, who has moved from one room into another and closed the door behind her, not from denial or avoidance, but from the simple, hard-earned discipline of knowing that the most important work is always the work in front of you. She was not thinking about Marcus. She was not savoring anything. She was not sitting in the afterglow of a confrontation, or a victory, or a reckoning. She was on a call about a client in Charlotte, and the call was interesting, and the opportunity was real, and Monday morning in Atlanta was in full motion around her, and there was work to do. Outside her window the city continued. Below Marcus's car, the pavement of the street was ordinary and grey and permanent. Between them, across the ordinary geography of Buckhead on a Monday in October, the distance that the divorce had created and that nothing subsequent had collapsed resumed its proper dimensions, respectful, necessary, complete. And in that distance, which was not cold but simply clear, both of them went back to work. The weeks that followed the wedding moved with the specific, pressurized velocity of a crisis being managed by competent people who have no margin for anything but precision. Marcus Dillon's calendar for the 2 weeks after his return from a honeymoon that had been shortened from 10 days to 5, because the investor review meetings could not wait, and because Dominique, who had listened to everything on Monday evening with the full, unflinching attention of a woman who believes that information, however difficult, is always preferable to its absence, had told him to go handle his business, and they would talk more when he was back, was the kind of calendar that strips a man down to his operational core and leaves nothing for sentiment or reflection. Back-to-back meetings with Investor A and Investor B, each of them 3 hours long, and conducted with the exhausting forensic thoroughness of parties who have been given specific reasons for concern and are now requiring specific reasons for reassurance. A full-day session with the partner firm and their legal team, working through the environmental liability clause that Camille had identified, renegotiating its allocation across the partner agreements with the careful, clause-by-clause attention of attorneys who are being paid to find every possible vulnerability before recommitting, calls with Charles every morning at 7, calls with his project director every evening at 9. A site visit to Harmon Street on the Thursday of the first week, walking the development with the institutional investor's representative, pointing at concrete and steel and the specific, physical evidence of a project that was real and solid and worth the commitment being asked. It was hard work. It was the kind of work Marcus was good at, had always been good at, the kind that required everything and left no space for the softer, less manageable categories of his interior life. He was grateful for it, in the particular way of people who need a demanding external structure to keep the interior work at a manageable pace, because the interior work was also happening alongside the investor meetings and the legal sessions and the 7 o'clock calls with Charles, happening in the early mornings before the calendar began and in the late evenings after the last call ended, happening in the particular quality of silence that existed between him and Dominique as they navigated the first weeks of their marriage inside the aftermath of his disclosure. He had told her everything on that Monday evening. He had sat across from her in their penthouse on Peachtree Street, not the hotel suite home, their actual home that they had chosen together and that Dominique had been quietly, lovingly arranging over the 6 months since he had put her name on the deed, and he had told her about the invitation and the note and the intention behind both of them, and the Saturday afternoon investor communications and the Monday morning meeting with Charles and the visit to Camille's office, all of it in sequence, without mitigation and without the specific, careful editing that people apply to confessions when they are more interested in being forgiven than in being understood. He had given her the full account, including the part about why he had sent the invitation, the real reason, the small and human and unflattering one that had nothing to do with closure. Dominique had listened to all of it without interrupting. She was sitting in the armchair across from him, in the particular posture she adopted when she was processing something significant, upright still, her hands in her lap, her face carrying the concentrated attention of someone performing a surgery in her mind, examining each piece of information as it arrived and placing it precisely before receiving the next. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of someone organizing their anger, the silence of someone doing serious work. "I need to ask you something," she said finally, "and I need you to think before you answer. Not because I want a particular answer, but because I want an honest one." "All right," he said. "When you sent that invitation," she said, "how much of it was about her, and how much of it was about you?" He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about the envelope and the handwritten note, and the weeks of imagining Camille's face when she received it. He thought about what Charles had asked, "Why did you invite her?" and about the answer he had given Charles, and about whether that answer was the complete one. He thought about it honestly, with the full attention of a man who has made a commitment to stop editing himself. "It was entirely about me," he said. "She was just the vehicle. I wasn't thinking about what it would do to her. I was thinking about what witnessing her reaction would do for me. I wasn't even thinking about her as a person. I was thinking about her as the person who made me feel insufficient, and the idea that I wanted to feel sufficient again at her expense." Dominique looked at him for a long moment. "And the project?" she said. "The investors, the communications. That's what I built when I stopped seeing her as a person," he said. "Someone who knew the full architecture of everything I'd built, who I had reduced in my mind to a symbol of my old inadequacy, and who turned out to have moved so far past anything to do with me that she was operating in my professional world as a serious and independent force, and who gave my project the most honest scrutiny it had received." He paused. "She didn't destroy it, Dominique. She stress-tested it, and she was right about the liability clause." Another silence. Dominique looked at the window. Atlanta was lit below them in the evening dark, all its skyline indifferent and beautiful. Then she looked back at him and said, "I'm angry with you. I want you to understand that, not because you were in love with your ex-wife or because you couldn't let go. Those are human things, and I understand them. I'm angry because you made a decision that affected our wedding, our professional lives, and our marriage without telling me. I'm angry because you managed it alone when you should have told me, because we are supposed to be building a partnership, and you treated me like someone to be protected from information rather than someone to be trusted with it." "Yes," he said. He did not qualify it. He did not reach for context or explanation. He said yes, and let it be the complete response it was. "That is the thing I need you to fix," she said. "Not the project, not the investors, the habit of managing things alone and presenting me with the finished version. That is the thing that will end us, Marcus, if it continues. Not the invitation, not Camille Washington. The withholding." He looked at her across the living room of the home they had chosen together. He looked at her face, which was carrying anger and love simultaneously with the particular, fierce dignity of a woman who knows her worth and is not willing to negotiate it. He thought about the notes on kitchen counters. He thought about the counseling appointments he had agreed to and cancelled. He thought about the Montego Bay trip. He thought about 11 years of being a man who was present in every room except the rooms that mattered most. And he looked at his wife, the word still new enough to carry weight, to register as something he had chosen and been chosen by, and he understood with the full, unmitigated clarity of a man who has run out of distance between himself and his own patterns that this was the moment. Not the vows, not the ceremony, not the charcoal grey suit and the 400 guests, and the orchids and the marble. This moment, in their living room, in the aftermath of his disclosure, with Dominique's anger and love both fully present and both fully honest, was the moment that the marriage actually began. "I'll fix it," he said. "Not as a performance, not as a strategy. I'll fix it because I'm not willing to lose you the same way. I lost everything else by being somewhere else when I should have been here." She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once with the precise, surgical economy of a woman who accepts a commitment when it is made with sufficient weight. "Therapy," she said. "Ours, not just yours. Starting next week." "Yes," he said. "And you tell me things," she said. "When they're happening, not when they're resolved." "Yes," he said. She uncrossed her legs. She stood up. She looked at him one more time with the full, complicated, surviving warmth of someone who has received difficult information and chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to remain. "Come to bed," she said. "You have a long week ahead of you." He stood. He followed her. And the marriage, the real one, the one that would cost them both something, every day, and give them something real in return, began. The investor review meetings went well, not perfectly, and there was a moment in the second meeting with Investor B when the lead partner pushed back on the revised liability documentation with a specificity that required Marcus to spend 45 minutes in the room working through the clause language in real time with Charles. 45 minutes that felt longer than any 45 minutes Marcus had spent in a professional context in years, but well. Both institutional investors recommitted to their Phase 2 positions by the end of the second week. The partner firm's renegotiation concluded on the Friday of that week, with the revised clause language that addressed the environmental liability allocation that had been the pressure point, and the 30-day freeze was lifted with 3 weeks still remaining on its clock. The Harmon Street project resumed its timeline, delayed but intact. The foundation stress-tested and, as Camille had said it would be, sufficient. Devcore Capital, whose window had opened and then closed before they could move decisively through it, sent no formal communication. But Marcus heard through the compressed, efficient grapevine of Atlanta's development community that Raymond Ose had been in preliminary conversations with one of the institutional investors during the 30-day freeze, and that the investor had declined to engage further once the Dillon Capital Group review meeting had concluded satisfactorily. Marcus filed this information without particular satisfaction. He had won this one, but he understood with the clarity of a man who has been genuinely frightened that winning it had required the specific, painful assistance of his ex-wife's professional honesty, and that understanding lived in him not as humiliation, but as information. The kind of information that a serious man uses to become more serious. He made changes, real ones, not the performed kind. He brought in an independent financial advisor to review the Phase 2 structure of every active project in the Dillon Capital Group portfolio, not because Charles required it, but because Camille had been right that moving to Phase 2 commitments before fully stress testing. Phase 1 relationships was a pattern, and patterns required systematic correction, not just individual repair. He scheduled the review for the month of November and sat in every session, personally, which surprised his project directors, who were accustomed to receiving the results of such reviews in summary format. He was there. He asked the questions. He listened to the answers. He also called his mother, not the perfunctory call he had been planning, the brief, reassuring check-in of a busy son, but a real call, an hour-long call, during which Evelyn Dillon talked about her knees and her garden and the new pastor at her church, and Marcus listened to all of it with the full, unhurried attention of a man who is practicing being present and finds, to his quiet surprise, that it is not as difficult as he had made it. His mother said, near the end of the call, in the offhand way she had of delivering the things that mattered, "You sound different, baby. You sound like you're in the room." He had not known how to respond to that for a moment. Then he had said, "I'm working on it." "Mama," she had said, "Good, work on it." And the call had ended. He and Dominique started couples therapy on the second Wednesday of November, with a therapist named Dr. Patricia. Okafor, whose office was in a quiet building in Virginia Highland, and who had the particular, unhurried quality of a person who has seen every configuration of human difficulty and has been neither hardened nor surprised by any of them. The first session was uncomfortable, in the specific way that honesty in the presence of a neutral third party is always uncomfortable, the things said out loud that had previously only existed inside, the specific vulnerabilities of being seen fully by someone who does not love you yet and therefore has no reason to soften what they observe. Marcus sat in the room and said true things and listened to Dominique say true things and found that the discomfort, while real, was less unbearable than the alternative, which was the version of himself that arrived at the end of things without having said the true things. When there was still time, they went to Santorini in December, a rebooked honeymoon that was quieter and less effortful than the October version would have been. Two people who had already been tested by something real and had come through it holding on, sitting at a table above the caldera with wine and the particular warmth of a Mediterranean December, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't with equal ease. Dominique laughed at something Marcus said on the second evening, a genuine, unpracticed laugh, the private kind that belongs to people when they are completely at ease. And Marcus sat across from her and felt the hollow, for the first time since the wedding, simply gone. Not filled with anything dramatic or resolved by anything conclusive. Just gone, the way things go when they are no longer needed. When the conditions that produce them have finally actually changed. He thought about Camille once during those 5 days briefly, without weight. He thought about her office and the cream blazer and the Monday morning honesty. And he thought about what she had built in the 3 years since the divorce. The firm, the clients, the security detail that was not theatre, the professional reputation that had grown large enough to make waves in the Atlanta development community, without his name attached to it. He felt, sitting above the caldera with his wine, something that surprised him with its simplicity. He felt glad for her, not in the complicated, compensatory way of someone working through residual feeling, but in the simple, clean way of a person who wishes another person well because wishing people well is what decent people do. He felt glad for her, and then he looked at Dominique and the thought moved through and was gone, replaced by the present, which was where he was making his life now. Back in Atlanta, the city continued its ordinary, relentless motion. The Harmon Street project broke ground on its Phase 2 development on the first Tuesday of the new year. In the cold, bright January air, with Marcus present in a hard hat that he wore without self-consciousness, and that his project director photographed for the company's social media with the particular, genuine energy of someone capturing a real moment rather than a staged one. The photograph was not the most polished image Dillon Capital Group had ever produced. It was, however, the most honest, and several of the investors who had been in the review meetings and who followed the company's progress with heightened attention since October noted, without entirely being able to articulate why, that the man in the photograph looked different from the man they had met across the review meeting table. More grounded, more present, less like a man performing success and more like a man doing work. Charles Whitfield, who saw the photograph on his own social media feed while having his morning coffee, looked at it for a moment, and then put his phone down and went back to his coffee and thought in the brief, private way that attorneys allow themselves to think about clients' lives, that Marcus Dillon had navigated something genuinely dangerous and had come out of it having learned something real, which was not the outcome Charles had been prepared to predict when he had watched Marcus walk out of his office on that Monday morning in October with the specific, unmoored look of a man who has just understood the full shape of a mistake. He had, Charles thought, gotten lucky, not in the cheap sense of luck that means things worked out fine. In the serious sense, the sense that matters, he had gotten the kind of lucky that looks like disaster while it is happening, and reveals itself only in retrospect to have been exactly the disruption that a man needs when the comfortable version of his life has started. building on foundations he has stopped checking. Not everyone got that kind of luck. Charles had been practicing long enough to know that most people didn't. The disruption came and the damage was real and the foundations were not checked in time and the thing that was built on them came down. Marcus had been close to that. He had stood at the edge of it. On a Monday morning in October, with Charles's email on his phone and Darnell's words in his ears, and a photograph of his ex-wife in a gold dress on his screen, and he had made, eventually imperfectly, at considerable cost, the right sequence of choices. He had told the truth to his attorney. He had gone to Camille's office not to threaten or negotiate, but to look at her directly. He had called his wife from the sidewalk. He had told Dominique everything on Monday evening. He had sat in the investor review meetings and the legal sessions and the therapy room and the hard hat at the groundbreaking, present and accountable, doing the actual work of the actual life he was actually living. Charles finished his coffee. He looked at the photograph one more time. He thought about the man in the hard hat and about the man who had sat in his office in October, and he thought about the specific, difficult, underappreciated work of becoming someone who can look clearly at the full cost of their own choices and remain standing. Then he put his phone in his pocket and walked to his office and began his own Monday, which had its own complications and its own demands and its own version of the same fundamental question that every Monday asks of every person who sits down at a desk and picks up a phone and begins the question of whether you are going to be honest today, whether you are going to be present today, whether you are going to do the work that the day is actually asking for rather than the work you have prepared for. In Buckhead, on the 10th floor, Camille Washington was on her second call of the morning. The Charlotte Technology Company had signed. The contract was good. The relationship was strong. Her senior partner had sent a bottle of champagne to the office, which was sitting on the credenza behind her desk in the particular, promising way of things that will be opened when there is time, which was not yet. The next client file was open on her desk. The next call was in 12 minutes. Outside her window, Atlanta was cold and clear and January sharp, the kind of morning that makes the skyline look like it has been cut from something more permanent than glass and steel, like it has always been there and will always be there, indifferent and magnificent and entirely unconcerned with the specific human dramas that play out in the rooms within it. She looked at the file. She looked at her notes. She looked at the city. She breathed in slowly and breathed out completely, the way Dr. Moss had taught her, and she felt the particular, grounded satisfaction of a Monday morning that is exactly what it should be, full of work and forward motion, and the clean, unhurried sense of a life being built exactly as intended, without apology and without performance, and without any remaining concern for the opinions of people who have not been in the room for 3 years. There is a particular quality that belongs to the end of things when the end has been earned rather than simply arrived at, a quality of settledness, of weight properly distributed, of a structure that has been tested and has held and knows now, with the specific confidence of tested things, that it can hold. Atlanta in the early spring carries something of this quality in its air. The winter, releasing its grip gradually, the dogwoods beginning in the neighborhoods, the particular warmth that returns to the city in March, not with the aggressive heat of summer, but with a gentleness that feels, after the sharp cold of January and February, like something deliberately offered. Marcus Dillon noticed it on the morning of the last Tuesday in March when he walked from the parking structure to the Dillon Capital Group offices on the 14th floor, the air carrying that first real warmth of the turning season. And he stood outside the building for a moment before going in, just standing in it, just feeling the air, which was something he would not have done a year ago, because a year ago he did not stand still long enough to feel the air. He had been in therapy with Dr. Okafor every Wednesday for 4 months. He had been in couples therapy with Dominique every other Wednesday for the same period. He had been present, consistently and without the cancellations and the managed absences that had characterized his earlier attempts at the interior work, and the consistency had produced something he had not entirely predicted, which was not the resolution of everything difficult but the gradual, unsexy, real development of a tolerance for difficulty that did not require him to manage it into invisibility. He could sit with things now, not comfortably. Comfort was not the goal, and Dr. Okafor had been clear about this from the beginning, that the goal was not comfort, but capacity, the capacity to remain present inside difficulty, without either fleeing it or being consumed by it. He was developing that capacity. It was slow work. It was the most important work he had ever done. The Harmon Street project was ahead of schedule. The Phase 2 development was proceeding with the particular, satisfying momentum of a structure whose foundation had been thoroughly tested and found solid, and the team moved through the work with a confidence that communicated itself to the investors and partners in the specific, intangible way that confidence always does when it is grounded in reality rather than performance. Marcus walked the site every Friday afternoon, hard hat on, notebooks in hand, asking questions and listening to the answers with the full attention that he had been practicing in every other area of his life, and that was beginning, his project director had told him with the frank directness of a man who had worked for Marcus for 6 years and therefore had the standing to say it, to change the culture of the company. People were talking more openly in the meetings. Problems were surfacing earlier, before they became crises, because the environment in which they operated had shifted, subtly but perceptibly, toward one in which the leader was willing to receive difficult information without making the bearer of it regret the delivery. Marcus had thought about this shift often in the preceding months, about where it had come from, about the specific sequence of events that had produced it. He had thought about it with the honesty that Dr. Okafor had been cultivating in him, which meant thinking about it without the flattering revision that ego applies to personal history. The shift had come from the wedding and everything the wedding had set in motion, from the investor review, meetings, and from telling Dominique the truth, and from sitting in Dr. Okafor's office, and from the groundbreaking in January, and from all the Mondays in between. But it had also come, and he was honest enough now to acknowledge this clearly, from Camille, from her assessment of the Harmon Street project, and the liability clause and the pattern she had identified in how he moved from Phase 1 to Phase 2 before the foundation was fully tested, from the honesty she had given him in her office on a Monday morning in October when she had no obligation to give him anything at all. He had not thanked her for it properly. He had thanked her in the moment, briefly, inadequately, and then walked down the corridor and ridden the elevator down and driven away into the recovery of his project and his marriage and his interior life, and the thank you had remained incomplete in a way that he had not known how to address without violating the professional and personal boundaries that both of them needed to maintain. He had talked about it with Dr. Okafor, not once but several times, returning to it from different angles as the months passed and his understanding of it deepened. Dr. Okafor had listened to each version with the same unhurried, neutral attention and had asked, in her precise, economical way, the questions that moved him from the surface of the thing to its actual center. What was incomplete about the thank you? What would completion require? What was he afraid the completion would mean? He had worked through these questions over several sessions with the slow, sometimes uncomfortable honesty that the work demanded, and he had arrived at answers that surprised him with their simplicity. The thank you was incomplete because gratitude of that magnitude, gratitude for the kind of honesty that changes the direction of a man's life, deserved acknowledgement in a form proportionate to what it had given. He was not afraid the completion would mean anything about his feelings for Camille, because his feelings for Camille were exactly what they should be. Genuine goodwill, genuine respect, and the completed, settled warmth of a history that had been real and was now fully in the past. Both things were true. He held them both. He had learned in Dr. Okafor's office that holding two difficult truths simultaneously without resolving them into a simpler, single story was not weakness, but a form of maturity that most people spent their whole lives avoiding. He held them both, and he decided, on a Wednesday evening in late February after his session with Dr. Okafor, that the completion would take the form of a letter. Not an email, a letter, written by hand on paper, in the same medium he had used for the note that had started everything. Because the symmetry of that mattered to him in a way he did not try to rationalize but simply accepted. He had written it over 3 evenings. Not because it was long. The letter was 4 paragraphs, less than 400 words, but because each paragraph required the full, honest attention of a man trying to say a true thing, without using it to say anything else, without letting gratitude tip into sentiment, without letting acknowledgement become a request for anything in return. He had shown it to Dominique before sending it, not because he needed her permission. He had been clear with Dr. Okafor and with himself that this was not about permission, but because showing it to Dominique was the practice of the transparency he had committed to, and because Dominique, who was a person of uncommon clarity and precision, would tell him if the letter was what he intended it to be, or if it had drifted into something he had not intended. Dominique had read it at the kitchen counter on a Saturday morning with her coffee, and Marcus had watched her read it without trying to read her expression, which was itself a small and genuine achievement. When she finished, she had looked up at him and said, "It's honest. It doesn't ask for anything. Send it." And then she had gone back to her coffee and the newspaper she had been reading. Before he handed her the letter, and the ordinariness of the transition, the ease with which she moved from the letter back to the newspaper, the absence of any charged or weighted atmosphere around the moment, had struck Marcus as one of the most genuinely intimate things he had experienced in his marriage, because it was the intimacy of two people who have built enough trust between them that difficult things can be handled without becoming events. He had sent the letter the following Monday, by courier to Camille's office address, marked personal. He had not expected a response and had not needed one. The completion was in the sending, in the 4 paragraphs written honestly, over 3 evenings and read by his wife on a Saturday morning and dispatched on a Monday without drama. The response came 12 days later, also a letter, also handwritten. Also 4 paragraphs, which was a coincidence or was not a coincidence, and which Marcus chose not to assign meaning to either way. He read it at his desk on the 14th floor, alone, in the late afternoon when the offices had quieted and the light through the windows was the particular amber of a late winter afternoon that is beginning to remember spring. The letter said, in Camille's handwriting, which was precise and unhurried in the way that her voice was, 4 things. The first was that she had received his letter and had appreciated its honesty. The second was that she wanted him to know that the professional actions she had taken, the conversations with investors and partners, the assessments she had given when asked, had not been motivated by the desire to hurt him or damage his work, and that if there had been a punitive element in the timing of those actions, she was willing to acknowledge that the timing had not been entirely neutral, and that she owned that acknowledgement without apology, but with honesty. The third was that she was glad the project had survived, because she had meant what she said. It was a good project, well built, and the city needed it. The 4th paragraph was the one that Marcus read 3 times, slowly, giving each sentence the individual attention it deserved. It said, "I have been thinking, in the months since October, about what it means to fully complete something. Not just to end it or survive it or build something new on top of it, but to complete it, to look at the whole shape of it, including the parts that were hard and the parts that were our fault, and the parts that we handled well and the parts that we didn't, and to hold all of it together in one honest view, without letting any part of it distort the rest. I think we have done that now. I think the shape of what we were to each other is complete. I want you to know that I think of those years, all of them, as years that mattered. They made me who I am in ways I am still discovering. I am glad you are well. I am glad she is what she is. Build the things worth building, Marcus. You know how? He sat with the letter for a long time after he finished reading it. The amber light moved across the desk as the afternoon continued its ordinary, unhurried progress toward evening. He sat with the letter, and he felt the completion that it described. Not as a loss, not as a closing, but as a thing fully done, a structure fully finished, standing on its own ground and needing nothing more added to it. He felt the particular, quiet dignity of something real that has been honestly reckoned with and can now exist in the past as what it actually was. Not a failure, not a wound, not a cautionary tale, but a life lived by two people who were serious about living, who did not always do it well, who built things and lost things and hurt each other and forgave each other and went on. He folded the letter. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He picked up his phone and sent Dominique a message that said, "Dinner tonight? Somewhere nice." She replied within 30 seconds, "Yes, you're choosing." He smiled at his phone in the empty afternoon office and thought that the 30-second response, the ease of it, the ordinary, specific warmth of a person who is glad to hear from you, was what he had been working toward all along. Not the ceremony or the 400 guests or the charcoal grey suit or the marble floors. This. He chose the restaurant. He drove home. He changed. He and Dominique went to dinner at a quiet place on the Beltline that they had discovered together in January and had gone back to 3 times since, because it was the kind of restaurant that rewards return visits. The menu, cycling with the season, the staff recognizing them now by the 3rd visit, the corner table that had somehow become theirs through the natural accumulation of preference. They sat in the corner and ordered and talked about the things that were happening in their lives. The Harmon Street project, Dominique's department at Grady, the couple they had met at the therapy practice, who had invited them to dinner the following weekend, the possible trip to Nairobi in the summer that Dominique's college friend had been proposing for 2 years, and that was beginning to seem like it might actually happen. They talked about ordinary things. They talked about them with full attention, both of them present in the corner table in the restaurant on the Beltline in Atlanta on a Tuesday evening in late March, with the first warmth of spring in the air outside, and the food arriving in courses and the wine in their glasses, and the specific, irreplaceable intimacy of two people who have been through something real together and have come out of it having chosen each other fully, with information, with honesty, with the complete knowledge of what choosing each other costs and what it gives. Marcus looked at his wife across the table. He thought about presence. He thought about what it had taken him to learn what presence actually meant. Not proximity, not showing up at the right events and saying the right things and arriving on time, but the actual interior work of being fully in the room, fully with the person in front of you, fully available to the moment as it is, rather than the moment as you have managed it to be. He thought about how long it had taken him to learn it, and about what it had cost, and about the specific, painful, inadvisable series of events that had finally made it possible. He thought about all of it without self-congratulation and without self-condemnation, which was itself the thing, the actual practice, the holding of difficulty without resolving it into a story that served his comfort. "What are you thinking about?" Dominique said. He looked at her. He told her, not all of it, not in the comprehensive, processed form that he gave Dr. Okafor, but the truth of what was in his mind, offered directly and without management. She listened. She asked a question. He answered it. She said something that reframed the thought in a way he had not considered, which she did often because she was brilliant and her mind moved differently from his, and this was one of the genuine gifts of their specific pairing. He considered her reframe. He told her he would think about it. She told him she knew he would. They ate their food. They drank their wine. The evening moved around them, warm and ordinary and entirely, completely sufficient. Across the city, in a different neighborhood, Camille Washington was also at dinner. She was at a restaurant in Inman Park with her sister Renata and two friends from her Spelman days, women she had known for 20 years and who knew her in the specific, irreplaceable way that old friends know you, not just who you are now, but who you have been through every version of yourself, the struggling version and the lost version and the rebuilding version and the arrived version, all of them held in the collective, unceremonious memory of people who were present for all of it. They were loud at the table, in the warm, unguarded way of women who are not performing anything for anyone and have not been for the 2 hours. They have been sitting in this restaurant consuming excellent food and considerable wine and talking with the full, overlapping, interrupting energy of people who have too much to say and not enough evenings to say it in. Renata, who was Camille's older sister by 4 years and who ran the other half of the consulting firm and who had been Camille's closest witness through every chapter of the preceding 3 years, raised her glass at some point in the evening and looked at Camille across the table with the particular unsentimental warmth of a sister who has watched you do hard things and is not going to make a speech about it, 'cause you both know the speech and neither of you needs to hear it. To building things worth building, Renata said. Camille looked at her. She thought about the letter she had written, and the letter she had received, and the October morning in the corridor of the Grandeur Hall when she had told Marcus to get back to his wife and meant it. She thought about the cereal dinners and the thin-walled apartment and the notes on the kitchen counter. She thought about the mediator's office and the steady hand and the clear expression that he had read as coldness and that had been, in fact, its opposite. The expression of a woman who had been grieving for long enough that the formal end of the thing was not a wound but a release, clean and necessary and overdue. She thought about room 214 and the gold dress, and the bourbon on the marble counter and Gerald on her left and Thomas on her right and the fifth row and the composure that had not been performance but simply the natural state of a person who has done the work and arrived somewhere real. She thought about her company and her clients and the Charlotte technology firm and the Monday mornings and the laptop and the city through the window and the coffee and the work that was always waiting and always interesting and always entirely hers. She thought about all of it together, the full shape of it, the way she had described in the 4th paragraph of her letter, the whole honest view, all the parts, held together without distortion. She held it all, and it was complete, and it was heavy with what it had cost, and luminous with what it had given, and she held it with the settled, grounded peace of a woman who has done this, who has looked at the full shape of a significant chapter of her life and found it not wanting but sufficient, more than sufficient, real. She raised her glass. To building things worth building, she said. They drank. The restaurant was warm. The Atlanta night was outside the windows, pressing gently against the glass. The city lit and living and entirely indifferent to the specific human fullness of the room inside. The conversation continued. The wine continued. Renata said something that made everyone at the table laugh with the full, unguarded, entirely unpracticed laughter of people who are completely at ease. And Camille laughed with them, open and real and present, her grandmother's pearls at her throat. She wore them often now, not for occasions but for ordinary evenings, because some things are too good to save for special moments, catching the light of the warm restaurant in the specific, unhurried way of things that have found exactly the place they belong. Outside, Atlanta continued its ancient, relentless, magnificent motion. The traffic on the Beltline, the lights of the skyline, the spring air moving through the city's corridors, and parks and parking structures and penthouse, balconies and 10th-floor offices and restaurant, windows and everywhere between, carrying the specific, generous warmth of a season turning, of something cold becoming something possible, of the long, difficult, necessary work of winter giving way, finally and without ceremony, to the morning that comes after. The dogwoods were beginning. The azaleas were coming. The city was waking up into a new season with the ordinary, unsentimental momentum of a place that does not pause to reflect on what it has come through, but simply continues and forward, outward, upward, building and rebuilding, and building again on foundations that hold when they have been tested and are worth the structures raised upon them. And in two restaurants on two sides of the same city, two people who had built something real together and paid the full cost of what they had built and lost and learned and earned were sitting at dinner with the people they had chosen, in the life that was actually theirs, eating and drinking and talking and laughing and being fully and without remainder present. The story does not end with a grand gesture. It does not end with a speech or a revelation or the clean, satisfying resolution of everything difficult into everything earned. It ends the way real things end, not with a closing, but with a continuing, with the quiet, permanent, sufficient fact of two people who survived something they could have been destroyed by and came out of it more honest and more grounded and more capable of the thing that had always mattered most. It ends with dinner, with laughter, with a glass raised and a season turning and the city outside doing what cities do, holding everything, remembering nothing, making room for whatever comes next. It ends, as all honest stories end, not with arrival, but with motion. The motion of people who have done the hard work and are still, irreversibly, gloriously alive inside it. The motion of people who are building. He invited her to see who he had become. She arrived to show him who she already was. And somewhere in the collision of those two truths, both of them found the version of themselves they had been working toward all along, not together, but fully, finally, and without apology themselves. The end.